Imagine a room where time itself seems to falter. The air is thick with the perfume of burning wax, candlelight trembling against walls of stone. Outside, winter presses its cold breath against the windows of a monastery, but inside, within these cloistered walls, something stranger than prayer is unfolding. A monk bends low over his desk, his quill scratching across parchment made not from trees, but from the pale skin of animals. The sound is steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the silence around him. His hand does not falter, though the symbols he draws are unlike anything you or I have ever seen. They loop and coil, spiral and bend, marks that seem purposeful, deliberate, yet belonging to no known alphabet. He pauses, dips the quill again, continues. It is as if the page is guiding him, not the other way around. Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine this scene. Imagine that when the monk finally lifts his head, the page before him contains not words, but a whisper of something other. Something that seems written with intelligence, but not with the intelligence we know. Something that feels alive, breathing silently beneath its symbols. And then imagine this, that what you see before you is not merely a page, not merely ink and parchment, but a portal, an opening into a place no human has ever walked. For nearly 1,000 years such a book has existed. It has passed through hands both reverent and curious, endured centuries of fire, war and neglect, and yet remains unsolved. No language scholar has read it, no scientist has mapped its meaning. Cryptographers, codebreakers, even modern machines, all have leaned close, squinted, strained, only to emerge with failure on their tongues. What do we call a book that seems written by no one? What do we name a voice that does not match our species? What do we do when faced with something that should not exist? This is not a ghost story, though ghosts will linger in its shadows. It is not affable, though it often feels like one. It is instead a riddle bound in calfskin, a whisper inked in strange green and brown, a memory that does not belong to us, yet sits stubbornly in our libraries. Some call it nonsense. Others call it a hoax. But those who have sat in its presence, who have turned its pages slowly beneath trembling fingers, often speak of another sensation, something hard to explain. They say it does not feel like madness nor trickery, but something eerily deliberate, as though whoever wrote it wanted to be understood, but only by someone who was not human. Pause here. Consider this thought. If we discovered a message in the deep silence of space, a signal traced in patterns no radio had ever caught before, we would call it alien. We would call it proof. We would stop the world in its tracks. But what if the signal was never out there among the stars? What if it had been here on Earth all along, bound in a book nearly 9 centuries old? Tonight, we step gently into that mystery. We will walk candlelit corridors, tracing the footsteps of monks and merchants who sheltered this strange creation. We will stand beside kings and scholars who puzzled at its meaning, and beside cryptographers whose brilliant minds collapsed against its silence. We will wander its illustrations, gardens of impossible plants, maps of skies we do not recognize, strange women immersed in emerald pools, diagrams that look less like art than like instructions. Each image is a door, each page a question. And yet perhaps the strangest truth is this: the book is not gone. It is not a ruin lost to fire or decay. It still exists, fragile yet intact, kept safe in a modern library, resting under glass. You could walk into that library tomorrow, approach it slowly, lean close and see for yourself. Its pages would look back at you as they have looked back at all of us, for centuries, silent, waiting. This is not a forgotten relic. It is an active question. And the question is not only, what does this book mean, but perhaps something deeper, more unsettling. Who or what was meant to read it and to read? Because the truth is, this manuscript does not feel abandoned. It feels unfinished, as though still awaiting the arrival of the right eyes. Perhaps those eyes will never come. Perhaps those eyes are not ours. And so, as you listen tonight, let your mind soften. Let the steady rhythm of mystery pull you closer. Imagine the candle flame flickering, the quill scratching, the parchment breathing with unspoken words. Imagine holding a book that does not yield its secrets, a book that stares back into you as surely as you stare into it. This is the story of that book, a book written 900 years ago, a book that may not have been written by something human. And as we begin, remember this: some mysteries are puzzles meant to be solved. Others are mirrors, showing us not what they are, but what we fear, what we dream, and what we long to find. So shall we open it together? There are objects in this world that seem almost too strange to belong to it. They sit quietly, gathering dust in corners of forgotten libraries or behind the glass of museums, yet when one looks at them, a shiver rises unbidden. It is not fear, exactly, nor even wonder, but the peculiar sensation of encountering something that feels both familiar and impossible at once, like meeting a shadow you recognize but cannot name. Among these objects, there is one that stands apart. A book bound in calfskin, its pages thick and yellowed with age, its ink faded but not erased, its drawings vivid enough to feel as though they were placed there only yesterday. To open it is to be confronted not with knowledge but with a kind of defiance. It is a book that greets you but does not welcome you. It exists, yet it resists. Imagine standing in a quiet chamber, perhaps a library where the sound of footsteps is muffled by centuries of wear. The air smells faintly of paper and old wood, heavy with the scent of time. Before you, under protective glass, lies the book. At first you might think it no different than other medieval manuscripts, handwritten lines of ink, careful illustrations, an artistry belonging to another age. But the longer you look, the stranger it becomes. The letters, if one can even call them letters, do not match any alphabet you know. They are too neat to be accidental scribbles, too structured to be madness, and yet too alien to be recognized. As words, they curl like vines, repeat like patterns in nature, flow like streams of water across the page, endlessly consistent and yet endlessly unreadable. No matter how long you stare, meaning refuses to take shape. It is like listening to a voice speaking in your ear in a language you will never know, a voice perfectly calm, perfectly articulate, yet eternally beyond grasp. Turn the page, and the strangeness deepens. The drawings do not comfort, they disturb. Here are plants that seem almost real, their roots and stems drawn with care. But when you compare them to anything in the known world, they dissolve into impossibility. Leaves curve into shapes no plant has ever taken. Flowers bloom with petals that seem to belong to a dream rather than a garden. Some resemble herbs or blossoms we half recognize, yet everyone slips away from certainty, like a memory fading even as you reach for it. You cannot say if they are meant to heal, to poison, or to nourish, because they do not exist. They belong to an earth we never walked upon. And then there are the women, naked figures, drawn without shame, immersed in strange green pools, their bodies connected by intricate tubes and channels, as though they are part of some vast biological system. Some appear to bathe, others seem trapped, suspended in liquid that could be water or could be something else. They hold onto stars, into roots, into vessels that resemble no human invention. The drawings feel playful at first glance, almost whimsical, but the longer you gaze, the more unsettling they become. They are diagrams of something, but of what? A medical process? An alchemical ritual? Or something that defies even those categories? Elsewhere in the book, the illustrations take to the sky. Constellations of stars unlike any we have charted, circles and diagrams that suggest astronomical systems no astronomer has recorded. Are they maps of heavens we once believed in, or blueprints of another world entirely? You feel as you look upon them as though you are glimpsing a geography you were never meant to see. Every part of the manuscript is suffused with this contradiction. It is orderly, methodical, created by a steady hand that knew exactly what it was doing. And yet, everything it presents is unknowable. It is not the chaos of a madman, not the scribble of a prankster, but the calm, precise work of someone, or something, that meant for it to be used. It feels like a manual, a guide, a book of instructions. But instructions for whom? For centuries, this book has sat before us like a mirror turned the wrong way. Scholars, cryptographers, linguists, historians, even military codebreakers, have bent their minds against its text, certain that meaning lies just beyond the veil. And yet, every attempt has ended in failure. The more carefully it is studied, the more it slips away. Some who devote themselves too deeply to it describe a strange sensation, that the book does not want to be read, that it resists, that it laughs quietly at every effort to translate its voice. It is a riddle not because we lack the answer, but because perhaps there is no answer in the terms we expect. What is most haunting, though, is its craftsmanship. Unlike many medieval works, this manuscript shows no hesitation in its creation. There are no corrections, no scratched-out errors, no stumbling attempts at revision. Every line flows smoothly, perfectly consistent, as though the writer were transcribing from memory or copying something already known. The pages are filled without pause, without wandering thought. Whoever wrote this did so with certainty. They knew what they were writing, even if no one else does. This is what makes the manuscript so disquieting. If it were nonsense, we would expect nonsense. Jumbled scribbles, careless drawings, a randomness. That betrays its hollowness. But instead we find order, too much order. Patterns that repeat with statistical consistency. Words that follow rules of a grammar we cannot break. Illustrations that are deliberate, detailed, purposeful. It is the very structure of the book that unsettles us most, because structure suggests intelligence. And intelligence suggests intent, and intent, when it cannot be understood, becomes frightening. To hold the manuscript in your hands is to feel this paradox pressed into your palms. Its weight is real. The calfskin pages are real. The ink is real. But the content seems to hover on the edge of reality, as though it belongs elsewhere. You might imagine, as you lift a page, that the book itself is aware of you, that it is waiting, patient and silent, for the right reader to arrive. What kind of book does not yield its meaning for centuries? What kind of book survives war, fire, theft, neglect and time itself, only to remain as stubbornly unreadable as the day it was written? Books are made to be read, to transmit knowledge from one mind to another. But this book breaks that pact. It withholds, it frustrates, it teases. It exists, but does not give. It is, in the purest sense, a book that should not exist. And yet, it does. We might expect such a creation to belong to myth or legend, a story whispered in the dark. But this manuscript is not a tale. It is here, real, tangible, preserved in a modern library where any scholar may approach it. Its presence demands explanation. Its silence demands patience. Its strangeness demands imagination. Perhaps that is why it has fascinated us for so long. Not because it tells us something we do not know, but because it tells us nothing at all. And in that void our minds pour meaning. We imagine it is a book of alchemy, filled with forgotten recipes of power. We imagine it is a lost language of a vanished civilization. We imagine it is the diary of a traveler, written in code to hide discoveries too wondrous for the world. And some, whispering softly at the edge of night, imagine it is not human at all, that it was written by something other, something beyond. Thus, something that slipped briefly into our world, left behind its script and vanished again. It is a temptation too powerful to resist, to project ourselves into its silence, to see in its resistance not emptiness, but meaning beyond reach. And so, generation after generation, we continue to ask, who wrote this? Why? For whom? The answers may never come, but the mystery itself has endured, powerful enough to capture the imagination of monks, scholars, merchants, codebreakers and dreamers alike. Its silence is more enduring than the voices of entire empires, and so our journey begins. Here at the edge of this strange silence, a book that should not exist sits waiting in the quiet of history, its pages still whispering, its voice still unheard. To understand it, we must follow its trail into the lives of those who found it, cherished it, and puzzled over it. To grasp its mystery, we must step into the hands that first carried it into the light of history. The book itself is eternal, but its story begins in human hands. The 17th century was an age of contradictions. Europe trembled between devotion and discovery, faith and reason. The printing press had already scattered knowledge far and wide, yet much of the world remained cloaked in shadows, guarded by monasteries and private collections. At the heart of this tension stood the Jesuits, a brotherhood both feared and admired. They were scholars and missionaries, guardians of learning, but also keepers of secrets. Their libraries were not only repositories of wisdom, but vaults of mystery, places where books deemed too dangerous for the unprepared were locked away. It is into this world that the strange manuscript surfaced. Its pages, already centuries old by the 1600s, had wandered across unknown hands before arriving in the possession of the Jesuit order. We may never know precisely how it found its way into their archives. Perhaps it was gifted by a noble patron, eager to gain favor by donating his curiosities. Perhaps it was rescued from the chaos of war, snatched from the flames of a plundered library. Or perhaps, more unsettling still, it was acquired deliberately, recognized for its strangeness and hidden because of it. Picture a Jesuit library of that era, shelves heavy with manuscripts, their spines cracked, their bindings worn, the air thick with the scent of ink and dust. Candles cast a fragile glow across wooden desks. Monks in black robes bend over their texts, some copying scripture, others debating philosophy, still others cataloguing exotic works brought back by missionaries from distant continents. And somewhere among those shelves lies a book unlike any other, a book that even the Jesuits themselves cannot name. Its script resists all comparison, its images defy categorization. What does one do with such an object? Does one study it or conceal it? The Jesuits, for all their intellectual ambition, were deeply wary of forbidden knowledge. Their libraries contained grimoires, alchemical treatises, and heretical works locked away from public sight. These were not burned, as some might expect, but preserved under restriction. So to the Jesuits, dangerous knowledge was not always to be destroyed. It was to be guarded, studied quietly, protected from misuse. And so the manuscript was kept, not displayed, not explained, but stored. Its mystery deepened, sheltered by silence. We can imagine the cautious debates that might have taken place behind closed doors. One Jesuit, bold and curious, might argue that the script must be decoded, that God's creation cannot contain secrets unworthy of understanding. Another, more cautious, might warn that the book carries whispers of sorcery, that to peer too deeply into its diagrams is to risk inviting deception. And so the manuscript sat, passing quietly from hand to hand, each reader leaving no record of what they thought, each returning it to the shelves with more questions than answers. The Jesuit order thrived on information. They mapped the skies, studied mathematics, charted the lands of the Americas and Asia, compiled dictionaries of forgotten tongues. If they could not decipher this manuscript, it was not for lack of ability. It was because the book offered no door to enter, no foothold to climb. Its words were not merely foreign, they were untranslatable, unmoored from any known tongue. Its images were not merely strange, they were irreconcilable with either science or scripture. And in an age where heresy was punished by fire, perhaps, the safest decision was to keep silent. The secrecy of the Jesuits has always stirred suspicion. To outsiders, their libraries seemed less like schools and more like fortresses. There were whispers of hidden chambers, collections so vast and strange that even their own novices were forbidden to see them. Within those rumors, one can easily imagine the manuscript resting in a locked cabinet, brought out only on rare occasions, studied by candlelight, then returned to its hiding place before morning. Consider, too, the possibility that some within the order believed the manuscript was never meant for human eyes at all. The Jesuits were not strangers to the idea of divine mysteries. They believed God's creation spoke through symbols, through nature, through scripture itself. What if then they suspected the book was a false revelation, a trick, a counterfeit, a voice not of God but of something else? In an age of demons and angels, of visions and portents, how might one classify a book filled with words that no man could read? To them, perhaps, it was safer not to ask. Yet the manuscript did not remain entirely hidden. For reasons we can only speculate, it eventually passed out of Jesuit hands, or at least slipped into a state of semi-accessibility. We know this because of a letter written in the mid-17th century, describing the book in detail. Addressed. To a scholar in Rome, the letter is our first recorded description of the manuscript in history. It speaks of the book's strange script, its incomprehensible nature, and the failure of even the most learned minds to make sense of it. This letter is proof that by then, the Jesuits themselves were at a loss. But before we arrive at that letter, let us linger for a moment longer in their library, in the hush of their secrecy. Imagine a Jesuit scholar standing late at night, the candle burning low, the pages of the manuscript spread before him. He runs his finger along the text, not reading but tracing, as if by touch he might feel what the mind cannot grasp. The illustrations flicker in the candlelight, plants shifting shape, women dissolving into water, stars bending across the page. He feels a tightening in his chest, a sensation not unlike reverence but tinged with unease. The book is beautiful, undeniably beautiful, but it is also alien. He closes it quickly, extinguishes the candle, and whispers a prayer before leaving the chamber. What is it about secrecy that magnifies mystery? The Jesuit order did not invent the book, yet their silence around it gave it power. To hide something is to admit that it matters. To lock it away is to admit that it may be dangerous. And so, when whispers of the manuscript finally reached beyond their walls, the book was no longer merely a puzzle. It had become a forbidden riddle, guarded by those who guarded the most dangerous knowledge of all. In this way, the manuscript gathered weight not only from its strangeness, but from the shadows it lived in. A book no one could read became a book no one was allowed to read. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. When the letter describing it surfaced, readers across Europe were primed not only to marvel but to fear, not only to question, but to doubt whether such a thing should be deciphered at all. Perhaps this is why the manuscript has endured so powerfully. From its earliest recorded moment in history, it was not simply a text, it was a secret. And secrets have a way of growing larger than themselves. By the time the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the manuscript had already woven itself into a narrative larger than its pages. It was no longer just a book of strange words and pictures. It was a relic of mystery, a survivor of silence, a prize of libraries that specialized in what must not be spoken. It had been touched by the Jesuits, shaped by their shadows, wrapped in the aura of forbidden knowledge. And in that silence, its power only grew. When we next encounter the manuscript, it is through the words of that famous letter, the first true description written in the ashes of history. But before we turn to that letter, remember this: the Jesuits, for all their brilliance, could not unravel the manuscript. They could only guard it, as one guards a flame that might warm or burn, unable to decide which it was meant to do. Their library was filled with the voices of men, but in one corner sat a voice not their own, a voice that would not speak. And so they kept it hidden, and perhaps in doing so, they ensured its survival. History, more than anything, is a fragile thing. The vastness of our past does not survive in monuments alone, but in words, words that can so easily be burned, torn, drowned, or left to rot. Civilizations rise and fall, but their memory lives, only as long as their parchments, their letters, their fragile ink. A library fire can erase centuries in an afternoon. A single careless hand can lose forever what a lifetime once built. And so, when we stumble upon a surviving voice from the 17th century that dares to describe a book already centuries old by then, we must listen carefully. It is not simply a description, it is a survival. It is a miracle that the words endured at all. In the year 1665, a learned Jesuit named Athanasius Kircher, a man whose curiosity spanned the sciences, theology, and the hidden mysteries of the natural world, received a letter. It came from Prague, sent by Johannes Marcus Marci, a scholar, physician, and former rector of Charles University. The letter spoke of a manuscript, a strange, undecipherable manuscript, one that had already confounded brilliant men. It was sent to Kircher because, among his peers, Kircher was known as a man unafraid of the unknown, a Jesuit polymath who'd studied hieroglyphs, languages, and codes. If anyone might glimpse meaning in its silence, it was him. That letter, written in a trembling 17th-century hand, is the first known description of what we now call the Voynich manuscript. Without it, perhaps the book would have slipped, entirely from memory, scattered among forgotten shelves, eventually perishing in mold, war, or neglect. Instead, because of this fragile page of ink, the manuscript story continued. The letter is remarkable not only for what it says, but for what it admits. Marcy confessed that the manuscript had resisted every attempt at translation. He reported that even the learned minds of his age, men trained in theology, medicine, and languages, had failed. He added that the book was believed by some to be the work of Roger Bacon, the English philosopher and alchemist, whose brilliance was often associated with the dangerous edge of knowledge. Whether true or not, the attribution was enough to place the manuscript in the realm of the forbidden, the extraordinary, the dangerous. It was not simply an unknown book. It was already, even then, a book of rumor and legend. But pause for a moment and consider the delicacy of this survival. Marcy's letter could have been lost in any number of ways. It might have burned in one of the countless fires that consumed archives across Europe. It might have been misplaced in a drawer, its ink faded, its paper eaten by insects. It might have been discarded, deemed irrelevant once Kircher passed away. And yet, somehow, it endured. Today it rests preserved alongside the manuscript itself, a companion ghost to the enigma it describes. Imagine holding that letter now, the parchment thin, the ink dark, but slightly smudged by the centuries. Each curve of handwriting is a bridge across time, linking us to the moment Marcy bent over his desk, candlelight flickering, quill scratching as he tried to explain the inexplicable. He could not solve the mystery, but he could record his failure, and in that recording he ensured the mystery would live on. This letter is more than a note between scholars. It is an ember carried across centuries. Without it, the manuscript might have remained an object of private curiosity, tucked away, forgotten, eventually perishing in silence. With it, the manuscript was drawn into a network of minds, passed into conversation, framed as an unsolved riddle rather than a simple oddity. The letter elevated the manuscript from obscurity to enigma, but the survival of this letter is also a reminder of how much has been lost. Think of the other voices that might once have spoken of the manuscript. Perhaps monks in the 15th century debated its meaning in the margins of their own texts. Perhaps scholars in the 16th century wrote notes in letters now burned to ash. Perhaps entire chains of correspondence once circled around the book, all vanished except this single surviving fragment. History does not preserve evenly. It is a patchwork, with most of its cloth burned away. What we hold in our hands are the scraps, the surviving edges, the faintest threads of memory, and what fragile timing it was. The mid-17th century was not an age of peace. Europe was scarred by the 30 Years' War, a conflict that consumed nations, toppled dynasties, and reduced entire towns to rubble. Libraries were looted, universities ransacked, manuscripts carried away as spoils of war or destroyed as collateral damage. Even Prague, where Marcy lived, had suffered repeated occupations, its treasures plundered. That the manuscript survived those years at all is astonishing. That the letter describing it also survived is doubly miraculous. Consider the image. In the ashes of war, amid ruined churches and scattered pages, one book endures. And beside it a letter, fragile and small, still clinging to its ink. A letter that speaks of the book's mystery, a letter that names its strangeness, a letter that dares to admit its failure. From those ashes, our story continues. The tone of Marcy's words is not triumphant but weary. He does not boast of solving the riddle, he admits defeat. His voice carries the melancholy of a man who knows he is passing along not knowledge, but mystery. In this, the letter feels almost poetic. It is as if Marcy himself understood that the manuscript's fate was not to be solved, but to be carried forward, an eternal question passed from hand to hand. His role was not to end the story, but to keep it alive. And so the manuscript entered the orbit of Athanasius Kircher, who received it with curiosity, perhaps even with awe. Kircher was a man fascinated by the hidden patterns of the world. He believed that languages, no matter how strange, could be deciphered, that symbols could be unlocked. He had studied Egyptian hieroglyphs and claimed to understand their meaning, though in truth his interpretations were later shown to be flawed. Still, he was not a man who turned away from mystery. For him, the manuscript was not an obstacle but a challenge. What he made of it we cannot know with certainty. No translation survives from his hand, no commentary that reveals his conclusions. Perhaps he tried and failed like so many after him. Perhaps he set it aside, recognizing its resistance. Or perhaps, more haunting still, he glimpsed something in it that he dared not record, something he chose to leave in silence. What is certain is that the manuscript did not vanish. It remained, moving quietly through history, preserved through centuries of turmoil. The letter of 1665, in this way, serves as both a beginning and an ending. It is the beginning of our recorded awareness of the manuscript, the first moment when it steps into documented history, and it is the ending of an earlier chapter, the final whisper of a book whose origins lie in shadows we may never uncover. Everything before that letter is speculation, everything after it is history. But history, like fire, is fragile. Each time we encounter the manuscript in later centuries, we must remember how narrowly it escaped the fate of so many other works. Had the library that housed it burned, had the letter been lost, had war taken one more careless turn, we might not be speaking of it at all. The mystery would not have been preserved. It would have been erased, its silence lost in a silence even deeper. There is a haunting irony in this survival. The manuscript itself resists meaning, and yet it survives meaningfully. It tells us nothing, but it tells us enough to keep asking. The letter, too, does not solve, but sustains. Together they form a paradox, a book and a letter that endure not to reveal knowledge, but to preserve ignorance. They are monuments not to answers, but to questions. As we turn from the 17th century toward the modern age, we carry with us this sense of fragility. Every word we read is an accident of survival. Every page that meets our eyes is a survivor of fire, war, and neglect. And among these survivors, the manuscript is unique, not because it speaks, but because it does not. It is in this fragility that the manuscript gains its power. If it had perished, it would be nothing. If it had yielded its secrets, it would be a solved riddle, catalogued and filed away. But it has done neither. It has survived without speaking. It has endured without yielding. It exists as a question that has refused to die. And so we leave this chapter with the image of ashes, ashes of wars, ashes of burned libraries, ashes of forgotten letters. From those ashes, one fragile letter survived. From that letter, a manuscript emerged into history. And from that manuscript, a mystery grew so powerful that even centuries later, we still turn its pages with trembling hands. Our story now moves forward into a different kind of rediscovery. The centuries would pass, the world would change, and eventually the manuscript would step once more into the light. This time not in a Jesuit library, nor in the hands of 17th century scholars, but in the bustling, skeptical, modern age. But before it could be studied under electric lamps and examined with modern science, it first had to be found again. And so, from the ashes of history, we prepare her to walk into the moment of its rediscovery. The rediscovery of the manuscript in 1912 did not occur in a blaze of revelation, nor was it marked by triumphant fanfare. Instead, it emerged quietly, almost by accident, in the hands of a man whose life had been defined by chasing the hidden, the strange and the forbidden. That man was Wilfrid Michael Voynich, a Polish-born book dealer whose name would forever be entangled with the manuscript he uncovered. He was not merely a collector of books. He was a seeker of enigmas, a man who seemed destined to stumble upon the most perplexing text in recorded history. Yet as history so often shows, destiny can be both gift and curse. Wilfrid Voynich's life had already been marked by intrigue long before he ever laid eyes on the manuscript. Born in 1865 in the Russian-ruled territories of Poland, he grew up in a world where secrecy and resistance were intertwined. In his youth, he was involved in revolutionary movements, arrested for his political activities, and spent years in Siberian exile. These early encounters with struggle, secrecy, and coded networks of resistance left their imprint upon him. He would never be content with the ordinary or the mundane. When at last he escaped to Western Europe, he reinvented himself, not as a soldier or a politician, but as a man of books. Yet not just any books. His trade was in the rare, the arcane, the volumes that whispered of hidden knowledge. To enter Voynich's London bookshop in the early 20th century was to step into a sanctum of mystery. Ancient folios leaned against gilded manuscripts, alchemical treatises sat beside forgotten heresies, and Renaissance prints of celestial maps were displayed with quiet reverence. His was not the trade of a common bookseller, but of a merchant of enigmas, a man who trafficked in the allure of the past. Clients came not only for books, but for the sense that Voynich could place into their hands a piece of eternity, a relic of something long buried yet immortal. He cultivated an aura that was equal parts scholar and conjurer, and he seemed to thrive in the liminal space between scholarship and myth. It was in this role, as seeker and dealer of the arcane, that he made his fateful journey to Italy in 1912. The story has been told many times, yet it always carries the same air of improbability. In the Villa Mondragone, a Jesuit college and former palace near Rome, he was permitted to examine a collection of manuscripts. The Jesuits, strapped for funds, occasionally sold off texts from their libraries to support their institutions. Voynich, with his impeccable eye for rarity, wandered among the shelves, opening folios, weighing bindings, studying marginalia, and then somewhere in those vaulted rooms, his hands fell upon the manuscript. One imagines the moment, the crackle of the old binding, the strange stiffness of vellum, the shock of the first page. Instead of familiar Latin or Greek letters, the parchment was covered in looping alien script. Strange botanical illustrations filled the margins, plants that resembled nothing in nature. Other sections revealed naked women bathing in green pools, surrounded by spirals of tubes and stars. It was not the work of a forger or dilettante. It was careful, precise, crafted with the patience of a medieval scribe. Yet it defied recognition. Here was a book that looked like knowledge but refused to yield it. For Voynich, the sensation must have been electrifying. He had spent years handling rare manuscripts, yet this one was different. Most antiquarian finds are valuable because they can be placed within the map of knowledge, an early medical text, a forgotten commentary, a Renaissance codex. This book, however, refused placement. It did not simply extend the map. It seemed to come from an entirely different world. To hold it was to hold something utterly unique, something that hinted at secrets the world had never seen. In that moment, Voynich must have felt that fate had placed the book into his hands. His reaction was not that of a detached dealer seeking profit. He fell into obsession. In the weeks and months that followed, he would describe the manuscript in glowing, almost mystical terms. He convinced himself that it was indeed the lost work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar and proto-scientist. Bacon had been legendary for his experiments, his explorations of optics, alchemy, and medicine. To possess a lost Bacon, manuscript was to touch the origins of modern science itself, to hold a text that might predate the discoveries of Galileo and Newton. Voynich believed he had uncovered nothing less than a cornerstone of Western intellectual history. But here is where the story turns tragic. Voynich's belief in the manuscript was so absolute, so fervent, that it consumed him. He was not content merely to sell it or to display it. He wanted the world to recognize it as the revelation he believed it to be. He carried the manuscript across Europe, showing it to scholars, presenting it as a treasure that would rewrite history. Yet for all his enthusiasm, the book resisted explanation. Scholars examined it, puzzled over its script, studied its illustrations, and failed. The more it was studied, the more it seemed to dissolve into mystery. Voynich's obsession was romantic in the truest sense. He believed in the manuscript this way a lover believes in the beloved against all reason, with a faith that transcends doubt. But it was also eerie, for the manuscript seemed to demand such obsession. Those who touched it rarely remained indifferent. It invited projection, speculation, devotion. Voynich was not the first to fall under its spell, nor would he be the last. Yet in his life, the manuscript became less a possession than a haunting. As years passed, his conviction did not waver. He wrote letters, gave lectures, sought experts in paleography, linguistics, and cryptography. He hoped to prove beyond doubt that the manuscript was a Baconian relic, a work of genius centuries ahead of its time. And yet, the evidence remained elusive. The parchment dated plausibly to the 15th century, but the script defied comparison. The illustrations, while beautiful, depicted plants no botanist could name. Every avenue of inquiry led not to revelation, but to deeper uncertainty. Still, Voynich refused to let go. There is something deeply human and deeply tragic in his devotion. He believed he'd found a world-changing treasure, and he spent his remaining years chasing the proof that would elevate it. But in doing so, he tethered his own legacy to a book that refused to be known. His name is remembered, yes, but not as a discoverer of knowledge. Instead, he is remembered as the discoverer of a question, a puzzle that remains unsolved more than a century later. The irony is sharp. He sought eternal recognition for the book's answers, but instead achieved immortality for its silence. And yet, it is because of Voynich that the manuscript entered modern consciousness. Without him, it might have languished in a Jesuit library, forgotten, perhaps eventually discarded. It was his romantic obsession, his insistence on its significance, that carried the manuscript into the 20th century, into the hands of scholars, linguists, and cryptographers. His tragedy is also his triumph. He could not solve the riddle, but he ensured that it would not die. When he died in 1930, the manuscript remained unsolved, its secrets as opaque as the day he found it. His widow, Ethel Lillian Voynich herself, a figure of intrigue, a novelist, musician, and revolutionary sympathizer, retained the manuscript after his passing. She guarded it with the same intensity, though perhaps with less fervent hope of unlocking it. For her, it was both relic and burden, a legacy of her husband's consuming passion. Looking back, one cannot help but sense an eerie symmetry. The manuscript seems to attach itself to figures who live in the margins of history, men and women drawn to secrecy, revolution, obsession. It does not belong to the steady, the ordinary, or the secure. It calls to the restless, the romantic, the seekers of mysteries. And in Wilfrid Voynich it found its most faithful devotee, a man who gave it not understanding, but immortality. The rediscovery of 1912 is thus both beginning and curse. It is the moment the manuscript re-entered history, wrapped in the aura of one man's belief, but it is also the moment the book's silence became louder, amplified by modern eyes, modern hopes, modern failures. In Wilfrid Voynich's hands, the manuscript was reborn, not as a solved riddle, but as the greatest unsolved riddle of them all. And so the story moves from the singular figure of the merchant of mysteries into the collective frenzy of the early 20th century. Cryptographers, linguists, botanists, historians, all would take their turn at the manuscript, drawn by the same fascination that had consumed Voynich. The book was no longer hidden in Jesuit libraries or cloistered in forgotten drawers. It was out in the world, dazzling, haunting, and defying. Curse. When Wilfrid Voynich placed the mysterious book into the hands of scholars and codebreakers in the early 20th century, he believed he was gifting them the key to a lost chapter of human knowledge. What he gave them instead was a labyrinth, a text that seemed designed to entrap the very minds most capable of unraveling it. For decades, the manuscript circulated among some of the sharpest intellects in linguistics, cryptography, and military intelligence. And though each brought to it their formidable tools of logic and pattern, the book repelled them all. What began as a scholarly challenge soon took on the qualities of a curse. Sleepless nights, broken tempers, careers sidetracked, lives bent under the weight of a problem that refused to yield. The manuscript was no longer merely unreadable, it was malevolent in its unreadability. The timing of its rediscovery could not have been more fateful. The early 20th century was an age of codemakers and codebreakers. Empires lived and died on encrypted messages. Wars turned on the success or failure of deciphering enemy communications. The Great War had only sharpened the appetite for cryptanalysis, and by the 1920s and 30s, the field was swelling with talent. Cipher machines, frequency analysis, substitution tests, polyalphabetic grids, all the tricks of the cryptographic trade were reaching new levels of sophistication. It seemed inconceivable that a book of medieval origin could resist such modern scrutiny, and yet resist it did. The first to fall under its spell were the professional cryptographers who had cut their teeth in wartime. They approached the manuscript with the confidence of men who had cracked the most secure messages of their day. They applied frequency counts to the glyphs, measuring the repetitions of characters, comparing distributions to known languages. To their surprise, the script behaved like a language. It had internal consistency. Certain symbols clustered in ways that suggested grammar, while others reappeared with the regularity of common words. Yet every attempt to map these patterns onto a real language collapsed. If the text was a cipher, it was unlike any cipher ever devised. William Friedman, one of the most celebrated cryptanalysts of the 20th century, embodies the tragic arc of this struggle. Friedman had led the U.S. Army's code-breaking efforts, and during World War II, his team was instrumental in cracking the Japanese Purple cipher, one of the greatest cryptographic triumphs of the era. He was Eamon, whose brilliance was beyond dispute, whose methods had proven themselves against the hardest codes human ingenuity had produced. Yet the manuscript humbled him. For decades he returned to it in intervals, probing its mysteries with mathematical rigor. He and his wife, Elizabeth, herself a legendary cryptanalyst, attempted to detect underlying structures, hidden alphabets, even the possibility of artificial languages. The result was always the same: promising hints, dead ends, despair. The Friedmans were not alone. The manuscript drew in mathematicians, linguists, and amateur codebreakers across continents. Some claimed breakthroughs, announcing that they had found a hidden Romance language or an encoded form of Latin. Others insisted it was Hebrew in disguise, or shorthand, or a cipher built on complex grids of substitution. Each claim collapsed under scrutiny. The text was too slippery, too contradictory. Where one analyst saw a pattern, another saw randomness. Where one scholar claimed a solution, another disproved it within weeks. The manuscript did not yield itself to a single perspective, because it seemed to wear many masks. This slipperiness began to take a psychological toll. Cryptanalysis is not merely mechanical work, it demands an intimacy between mind and text. To break a cipher is to enter into the logic of its creator, to think their thoughts until their patterns reveal themselves. But the manuscript offered no such entry. Its patterns were tantalizing but empty, its structures suggestive but hollow. The more one studied it, the more it seemed to mock the effort. Codebreakers accustomed to victory began to question themselves. Was their failure proof of some deeper inadequacy? Or was the manuscript itself designed not to be broken, a trap set, centuries ago for minds yet unborn? This sense of entrapment deepened with time. By the mid-20th century, the manuscript had taken on the aura of a test, a riddle posed by history itself. Scholars wrote papers not to solve it, but to wrestle publicly with their inability to solve it. Journal articles became chronicles of failure, documenting approaches that ended in silence. The book's reputation grew not from revelation, but from resistance. It became the Mount Everest of cryptography, a peak scaled by noon, a symbol of both ambition and futility. The claustrophobia was real. Imagine spending weeks, months, years, staring at the same looping glyphs, convinced that just beyond the edge of perception lies the key. Every night the same pages return in dreams: plants that cannot be named, stars that do not match the sky, women bathing in impossible pools. The text whispers that it is a language, that sense is there if only one looks closely enough. And so the codebreaker looks closer, tighter, until the outside world fades. Meals are forgotten, nights stretch long, and still the book refuses to open. What begins as intellectual challenge ends as slow suffocation. One cannot help but suspect that the manuscript itself was shaped with such an effect in mind. It does not read like ordinary nonsense. Pure gibberish would collapse under scrutiny, revealing randomness. But this script is too disciplined, too consistent. It behaves like meaning without yielding meaning. It is a mirror that reflects effort, but gives back no image. Was it a deliberate hoax, crafted to entrap? Or was it truly a language, but one crafted by a mind alien to our categories of sense? These questions haunted the men and women who tried to break it, and the haunting itself became part of the curse. Even technology, when it entered the struggle, brought no salvation. As computers emerged in the latter half of the century, new hope flared. Surely machines, with their tireless ability to calculate patterns, could succeed where human intuition had failed. Programs were run, glyphs converted into strings of data, algorithms unleashed to search for statistical structures, and still, the manuscript resisted. Machines confirmed what humans already suspected, that the text had the statistical profile of natural language. But none could determine which language, or indeed whether any human tongue lay behind it. The curse was not only intellectual but emotional. Codebreakers spoke of the manuscript in tones of reverence and frustration, like monks confronted by a silent oracle. Some ruined reputations by declaring solutions too hastily. Others eroded their own health in obsessive study. The book seemed to demand total devotion, but rewarded that devotion only with more silence. It became, in its way, a parasite of attention, feeding on the brightest minds, offering only the promise of meaning while withholding the substance. And still, generation after generation, new minds took up the challenge. They could not resist. Something about the manuscript's strange script, its alien illustrations, its sheer refusal to be known, made it irresistible. To look at it was to feel that sense hovered just beyond reach, that a breakthrough lay one page away. The allure was not only the possibility of discovery, but the intimacy of the struggle itself. To grapple with the manuscript was to join a lineage of seekers, each one chained to the same unyielding riddle. By the late 20th century, the curse had acquired its own mythology. The manuscript was not merely a book, it was an ordeal. To attempt to solve it was to risk one's peace of mind, one's intellectual pride, perhaps even one's sanity. And yet, the attempts continued. Universities funded studies, amateur cryptographers filled forums, intelligence agencies ran analyses in secret. The book's silence had become more powerful than any revelation it might have offered. Its mystery, in refusing to be resolved, had made itself eternal. It is this atmosphere of tension, of claustrophobic struggle, that now prepares us to look closer at the manuscript's contents, for the cryptographers were not merely staring at empty glyphs. Page after page, their eyes moved across strange images, botanical drawings of plants that do not exist, diagrams of stars in unfamiliar patterns, naked women immersed in green pools linked by impossible tubes. These are not idle decorations, but part of the enigma itself. If the text resisted language, perhaps the images might speak another kind of truth. But here too the manuscript mocked its interpreters, giving the impression of science without the substance, knowledge, without clarity. And so, having watched the cryptographers break themselves against the book's silence, we turn now to those images, to the strange illustrations that decorate its pages. Perhaps in these pictures, more than in the looping text, lies a clue to the heart of the mystery. To look upon the manuscript is to feel that its words hide secrets, but it is the illustrations that first arrest the eye, pulling the imagination into their strange, luminous world. Before one even begins to count glyphs or measure letter frequency, the gaze is captured by curling leaves, flowering stems, roots drawn with meticulous care. Yet something in these depictions feels slightly off, as though the artist was not documenting the flora of our earth, but remembering it from afar, through a misted glass, or perhaps through dreams. The plants seem to hover in that uneasy space between recognition and alienness. Some resemble herbs familiar to medieval Europe, a stem like fennel, a flower shaped like marigold, a root vaguely akin to ginger. But on closer inspection, none of them match reality. Leaves twist into impossible spirals, roots fork in ways that defy botany, blossoms bloom in patterns no known species has ever borne. They are both intimate and unearthly, gardens glimpsed, in a parallel world. Imagine the medieval reader encountering these pages by candlelight. At first they might believe they were seeing a herbal, one of those thick compendiums of medicinal plants so beloved in monasteries and apothecaries. Such books were common companions in the Middle Ages, blending observation with folk medicine, illustration with recipe. But in this manuscript, the familiarity falters. The viewer recognizes the intention, yet fails to identify the subject. This was not instruction for treating illness or brewing remedies. It was something else entirely. What strikes modern viewers is the care in the drawings. These are not idle doodles, not the scrawls of a forger mocking knowledge. They are deliberate, detailed, and filled with subtle shading and coloration. Whoever painted them cared deeply about these plants, real or imagined. The greens are varied, the petals washed in soft hues, the roots outlined with precision. One feels the illustrator knew these plants intimately, as if they had handled them, studied them, perhaps even cultivated them. And yet they do not exist on Earth. This paradox fuels the dreamlike quality, a garden that feels tended but is beyond reach, alive in pigment but absent in reality. As one turns the pages, patterns emerge. Some plants appear plausible enough that scholars have tried to match them to species. Maybe this one is a sunflower, maybe that one is watercress. Whole papers have been written on these attempted identifications, drawing parallels between stem curvature, leaf count, root branching, but always the matches fall short. Each plant diverges in crucial details, as though modeled from memory but corrupted by imagination, or constructed according to rules of a biology we do not share. The sensation is uncanny. It is like standing in a garden in twilight, where shapes suggest familiarity, but shadows distort them beyond certainty. One cannot shake the feeling that these plants are real somewhere, just not here. Perhaps on a forgotten continent, perhaps in a vanished epoch, perhaps in a world we can only glimpse through dreams. To wander these pages is to wander a botany, of elsewhere the flora of a parallel creation. Some illustrations are even stranger. In a few, the roots do not look organic at all, but geometric, curling into spiral shapes or angular patterns, like diagrams of force rather than living matter. Others depict stems that weave into knot-like tangles, as though the plant is less a growing thing than a symbol. These pages feel less like natural history and more like metaphysics. The garden is no longer earthly but emblematic, each plant a cipher in itself, a sign whose meaning is withheld. And yet, within this alien flora, one senses a kind of coherence. The plants may not exist, but they obey rules. Leaves sprout in pairs, flowers balance upon stems, roots anchor with weight. The artist's imagination was disciplined, not chaotic. This was not fantasy for its own sake, but a structured vision, as if cataloguing a coherent but unknown biology. That very coherence makes the pages more unsettling. If these were wild inventions, we might dismiss them as nonsense. But they seem ordered, purposeful, systematic. The unknown world has its own logic, and the manuscript is its record. Step deeper into this garden, and the dream intensifies. Imagine running your hand across the vellum, feeling the texture of centuries-old skin, while your eyes move over a plant with fat tubular roots that bulge like swollen limbs. Above, leaves stretch long and curling, and at their tips sprout blossoms unlike any on earth. Geometric bursts, clustered as though designed by mathematics. More than biology, imagine the faint scent of ink, the hush of aliberry, the flicker of candlelight. It is easy to feel transported, as if the book is not just an object but a doorway, a threshold into a botanical dimension parallel to our own. And what are these plants for? That question has obsessed generations. Are they medicinal, symbols of healing for illnesses we cannot name? Were they drawn for ritual, for alchemy, for magic? Some have argued they represent not plants at all, but concepts, encoded diagrams of something spiritual or cosmological. If so, the garden is not a garden of earth, but of the mind, a psychic botany, each root and petal a metaphor for processes beyond material nature. The book's very refusal to correspond with our world opens the possibility that it corresponds with another, whether physical or mystical. This duality, the sense that the plants are both concrete and impossible, creates the dreamlike tone that suffuses the manuscript. Looking at them is like looking into a memory of a place you've never visited, a déjà vu of landscapes that do not exist. The viewer is invited not merely to observe, but to enter, to imagine walking among these plants, feeling the cool air of their shaded leaves, the strange perfumes of their blossoms. One can almost hear bees buzzing in those alien flowers, taste bitter roots ground into unknown medicines, feel the soil of that world underfoot. Some viewers describe the experience as peaceful, others as unsettling, for in these gardens lies both beauty and unease. The plants are lush yet unfamiliar, orderly yet estranged. They embody the mystery of the entire manuscript, crafted with care, heavy with intention, but belonging to no world we know. Tossed and among them, even in imagination, is to feel oneself estranged from earth, gently displaced into a twilight zone where knowledge itself is foreign. This strangeness deepens as one turns the pages toward the next section of illustrations. Suddenly, alongside these impossible plants, appear human figures, naked women immersed in strange pools connected by tubes and channels to the roots and stems. It is as though the gardens open onto rituals, as though the flora are not merely drawn for their own sake, but a part of some larger system in which human bodies are intertwined with plant life. The transition is startling. One moment, the reader wanders alien gardens. The next, they encounter figures bathing in emerald green waters, their bodies half immersed in vessels that seem grown rather than built. Tubes snake from roots into pools, connecting plant and flesh. The garden is no longer just a dream of flora, but a stage upon which unknown rites are enacted. The viewer realizes that the plants were only the beginning. Beyond them lies a more profound strangeness, where biology merges with ritual, where human and botanical worlds collapse into one another. Thus the garden leads inexorably toward the bathing women, the next chapter of the manuscript's mystery. But before we step into those waters, let us pause. For in the pages of the garden, in the leaves and roots and blossoms of plants that never were, we have already walked across a threshold. We have glimpsed not only an unknown flora, but the possibility of an unknown world, lovingly preserved in ink and parchment, waiting to envelop those who dare to turn the page. Turn another page and the gardens fade. The curling stems, the blossoms of unknown flowers, the impossible roots, all of them fall behind, replaced by something even stranger. Suddenly the viewer is confronted not with plants, but with people. Naked women, rendered in delicate but unmistakable strokes, appear across the vellum. They are not standing in ordinary landscapes. They are not portraits or figures in a biblical tableau, nor saints nor queens nor mythological goddesses. Instead, they are immersed, half hidden in strange pools of green, as though the parchment itself were a window onto a subterranean bathhouse of another world. The images are mesmerizing. In some, the women recline in rounded tubs, the water shaded in pale green pigments that still shimmer faintly after 5 centuries. In others, their bodies are connected by pipes, channels, and conduits that snake across. The pages like arteries. Sometimes the pools themselves seem alive, shaped not like stone or wood, but like organic vessels, swollen, irregular, almost vegetal. The entire composition feels less like art for beauty's sake and more like a diagram, a record of a process, an anatomy of ritual. And yet the figures are drawn with a strange intimacy, as though the illustrator regarded them not as abstractions, but as beings both ordinary and sacred. At first glance, the images recall alchemy. Medieval manuscripts are filled with depictions of baths, distillations, vessels, and transformations of matter. Alchemists often describe their work in metaphors of thebody, substances being purified. In the womb of the flask, essences circulating like blood through veins. Could these women be metaphors too? Perhaps the artist used their forms to describe processes of transformation, healing, or the transmutation of substances. A green pool might stand for a solution in which a plant was steeped. A pipe might mark the transfer of essence from one stage of a procedure to another. In this reading, the naked women are not literal but symbolic, embodied vessels of nature's hidden processes. And yet, to say alchemy does not dissolve the strangeness. For even among alchemical manuscripts, these images are unusual. The women are too many, too insistent, too central. They appear again and again, page after page, in configurations that feel less like allegory and more like obsession. They smile faintly, they gesture, they lean into their vessels as if bathing in communion. They are not incidental, they are the manuscript's pulse. Another theory suggests medicine. Baths were central to medieval healing. Mineral waters, thermal, springs, herbal infusions. Physicians prescribed immersion in heated waters to balance humors, relieve ailments, or draw out toxins. Perhaps these images record a pharmacological practice now lost, a tradition of therapeutic bathing drawn alongside. Plants that were ingredients in the baths. The green pigment could represent mineral-laden water, infused with herbs for specific cures. The pipes might illustrate circulation, suggesting how fluids moved through the body, or how treatments passed from vessel to vessel. In this reading, the women are not abstract metaphors but patients, drawn into the manuscript as visual shorthand for medical procedures, the human presence required to complete the recipe. But even this explanation falters, for these baths are not mere tubs, they are elaborate systems. Pipes connect them in networks as though one vessel drains into another, or one figure's bath feeds into the next. In some drawings, women are linked hand to hand, foot to foot, breast to bathby channels that seem too mechanical for simple healing. It is as though the manuscript envisions the human body not as a single organism, but as a node in a vast biological machine, a living engine where fluids circulate endlessly. It is here that the images slip from the quaint into the uncanny. To gaze at them is to feel unease, a shiver of recognition twisted into alien form. They seem to hint at a worldview where humanity is not distinct from nature but dissolved into it, absorbed into flows of water, roots, stars, and essences. The women are not individuals but components, cogs in an organic apparatus. Their nudity underscores this, stripping away individuality, presenting the body as pure function, pure vessel. Some viewers see in these drawings not healing but control. The channels and conduits suggest a system designed not to nurture, but to extract, to harness. Are these diagrams of medicine or of exploitation? Are the figures rejuvenated in the green baths or drained by them? The ambiguity lingers. The smiles on their faces are subtle, unreadable. Their eyes do not tell us if this immersion is pleasure or necessity, salvation or imprisonment. Other interpretations reach further still, into speculation bordering on the science fiction. Could these be images of biology, not of Earth, but of elsewhere? A record of beings for whom immersion in fluid was natural, even essential. In this reading, the manuscript becomes not metaphor nor allegory, but ethnography, a depiction of life as it exists in some other realm, perhaps far removed in space or time. The pools become amniotic seas, life-giving chambers in which creatures are sustained. The pipes are arteries of a planetary organism. The figures, though drawn as women, might be archetypes of an alien biology rendered in human form for comprehensibility. Whether one chooses alchemy, medicine, or alien biology, the images resist resolution. Their very multiplicity of interpretation is their power. The longer one looks, the less certain one feels. Each explanation seems plausible for a moment, only to dissolve under scrutiny. The pools remain green, the pipes remain strange, the women remain silent, and always the tone is faintly sinister. There is something unsettling about the repetition, the proliferation of bodies linked and immersed. It is not a single healing bath, but dozens, hundreds carried across folios. The manuscript insists on showing us these scenes again and again, as though trying to fix an image in our minds. The human body, inextricably bound to liquid, conduit, and vessel. One begins to wonder whether the act of looking itself is a kind of initiation, whether by gazing into these pages, we too are drawn into the circuit, our imaginations feeding the pools as surely as the painted women do. Even the artistry adds to this uncanniness. The bodies are not idealized, not eroticized, not drawn as goddesses of beauty. They are plain, almost childish in line, their forms simplified but unmistakable. This lack of stylization removes distance. They feel immediate, almost clinical. They could be anyone, they could be us. And then, just as the mind begins to reel from the strangeness of this watery world, the manuscript turns upward. From the baths and pools, from the green pigment and winding pipes, the gaze is drawn to the margins above. There, scattered among the diagrams, begin the stars. Zodiac signs, celestial diagrams, wheels of constellations. The bodies in the baths are not isolated after all. They are set beneath the heavens, their vessels aligned with cosmic cycles. It is as though the women immersed in green pools are part of a larger rhythm, their flows echoing the movements of the stars. The transition is seamless but startling. From roots to baths, from baths to constellations, the manuscript guides the reader ever upward, suggesting that the mystery of the body is bound to the mystery of the sky. The waters in which the women bathe are not merely earthly. They are tidal, celestial, cosmological. What happens in the pools reflects what happens among their stars. And so in these pages, we glimpse the full scope of the unknown worldview that created the manuscript, a vision where plants, humans, and stars form a single, unified system, their essences circulating through baths, pipes, and constellations alike. To turn the page is to feel oneself drawn deeper into that system, deeper into the enigma, as the waters of the pools begin to rise toward the heavens above. From the green pools where women drift in their silent communion, the manuscript directs us upward. It is as though the book itself knows, to understand the waters below, one must look to the heavens above. And so, in a sudden shift of imagery, the vellum blossoms into circles, vast diagrams of stars, wheels of celestial order, constellations drawn in ways both eerily familiar and bewilderingly foreign. The first impression is wonder. The pages open like windows into the cosmos, as if the parchment has become transparent, and the reader gazes through it into night itself. Constellations whirl in intricate loops. Stars are marked by tiny dots, suns by radiant bursts. Around them, curling lines trace patterns that defy neat explanation. The effect is dizzying. These are no tittle doodles, nor simple star maps of the medieval sort. They seem deliberate, systematic, purposeful, yet they correspond to no astronomy we know. At times, the manuscript shows familiar signs, the symbols of the zodiac, those ancient figures passed down from Babylon through Greece and Rome into medieval Europe. Aries, Taurus, Leo. They appear here, recognizable enough to reassure us that the scribe at least knew of earthly traditions. But their context is odd. The zodiac signs are not isolated emblems. Instead, they are embedded in elaborate wheels of figures surrounded by the same naked women we saw in the baths, now standing or reclining in the margins of the stars, each holding stars or tethered to them by delicate threads. The effect is uncanny. It is as though the constellations are not merely patterns in the sky, but living forces, each attended by human vessels whose bodies participate in the rhythm of the cosmos. What could it mean? Some scholars suggest astrology. Medieval thinkers did not separate astronomy from astrology as we do. To them, the stars were not only lights in the heavens, but influences on the body, on plants, on fate itself. A diagram showing zodiac signs linked to human figures might reflect the belief that stars governed health, fertility, and destiny. Perhaps the women are not random decorations, but embodiments of astrological houses tied to specific parts of the body or cycles of nature. In this interpretation, the pools below and the stars above form a continuum. The baths represent bodily processes, the constellations represent their celestial causes, and together they map the invisible web binding the human to the universe. But the Voynich sky resists such neat framing. For while astrology explains the zodiac symbols, it does not explain the many other charts, the wheels filled with unknown symbols, the spiraling forms that resemble galaxies before the concept of galaxies even existed, the star clusters arranged in geometric sequences alien to medieval science. These are not simply echoes of known traditions. They are something else, something new or something forgotten. One diagram in particular has haunted generations of viewers. It shows a great wheel, divided into sectors, filled with stars and text with lines radiating outward like spokes. Around its edge cluster more of the women, each one tethered to the wheel by a line, as though they are satellites orbiting a central force. Is this an astronomy of cycles? A calendar of time? A cosmology of souls revolving through celestial ages? The image defies certainty, but it radiates purpose. Whoever drew it was mapping not chaos, but order. The possibility arises, what if these are not depictions of our sky at all? What if the manuscript is not astronomy, but cosmography, maps of an entirely different cosmos? To imagine this is to step into vertigo. If so, then the book is not simply a curiosity of medieval learning. It is a window onto a worldview wholly alien to ours. Perhaps the stars shown are from a perspective not of Earth, but of another place. Perhaps the zodiac is only half recognizable, because it was adapted, transformed, projected from a vantage point no longer accessible to us. To read these charts as astronomy might be like trying to read a map of another planet's continents using only the outlines of Europe as a guide. The familiar signs anchor us, but the rest slips beyond comprehension. And yet, even in their strangeness, the diagrams have a beauty that transcends understanding. Their symmetry, their elegance, the careful hand that inked each curve and painted, each star in blue or gold, all of it bespeaks reverence. Whoever made these pages believed they were charting something vast, something holy. The manuscript becomes less a book and more a temple, a portable cosmos inscribed on calfskin, a sky one can hold in one's lap. The psychological effect of these images is profound. To gaze at them is to feel thesmalness of one's own mind, to be pulled into a vision larger than comprehension. The pools of women already blurred the boundaries of the human body. The stars erased them altogether. In this cosmos, people are threads in a pattern too vast to unravel, their lives pulled by forces traced in circles and spirals far above. The manuscript whispers that the human story is written not in words but in stars, that the ink on the page is only a mirror of the burning ink of the heavens. And then comes the strangest realization of all. The charts are not static. At least, they do not feel static. They carry a rhythm, a sense of motion, as though the stars and women and symbols are not frozen but turning, endlessly revolving like the heavens themselves. It is easy to imagine the medieval reader holding the manuscript by candlelight, staring so long at the wheels that the flicker of flame seems to set them in motion, the circles spinning, the stars orbiting, the cosmos alive on the page. What was the purpose of such maps? Were they instructions, ritual guides for aligning human action with celestial cycles? Were they records of astronomical observations encoded in a script now lost? Or were they visions, artistic renderings of mystical experience, glimpses of a sky seen not by the eyes but by the inner mind? The manuscript offers no answer, only the persistence of its silence. Some modern theorists have even suggested that the charts are proto-scientific, that they encode astronomical data centuries ahead of their time. Spirals resembling galaxies, clusters suggestive of star systems, networks that echo orbital mechanics, all of these have been proposed. But such claims founder on the absence of proof. Without deciphering the script, we cannot know if the diagrams are scientific data or mystical symbols. The line between the two blurs. Perhaps to the scribe there was no line at all. What is certain is the awe they inspire. The plants and baths of earlier folios already stretch the imagination, but the celestial diagrams expand it to breaking point. The book is no longer about herbs or healing or women in water. It is about the cosmos entire, the binding of body, earth, and sky into one seamless system. To hold it is to cradle a vision of totality, a universe closed and complete within its pages. And yet always the mystery gnaws. For if this system was coherent to its makers, why is it opaque to us? Why do the stars refuse to align with ours? Why do the wheels refuse to yield their logic? It is as though the manuscript were written, not just in a lost language, but from within a lost reality. To open it is to be reminded that human understanding is fragile, temporary, bounded. We live under the illusion that the universe is comprehensible, that the sky obeys rules we can grasp. The manuscript laughs at this. It says, "Here is another sky, one you cannot know, yet one that once seemed perfectly real to someone. The effect is humbling. It reduces our certainty, it expands our wonder. For the impossible sky in the manuscript is not only a puzzle, it is a mirror of the vastness of mystery itself. Every star drawn on vellum is a reminder of the infinite stars above us, most of which will never be mapped, never be named, never be understood. The manuscript becomes an emblem of the human condition, reaching toward the cosmos, inscribing our awe, yet forever falling short of comprehension. Slowly, the reader is pulled back to earth. The candlelight gutters, the pages close. The impossible sky folds back into leather binding. The manuscript remains silent, unread, as it has for centuries. And yet its stars linger in the mind, haunting and unresolved. And so inevitably the question arises, if the sky in these pages is impossible, then what of us? What are we to make of this object, this relic of thought that defies the categories of science and history alike? Some would dedicate their lives to answering that question. Scholars, linguists, cryptographers, men and women of the 20th century would take up the manuscript and try to wrestle its secrets from silence. They would believe, for a time, that the book could be explained, that the impossible could be reduced to logic. But the manuscript resists, always it resists, and so from stars and constellations we descend once more to the human effort, to the scholars who tried to make sense of what the scribe had seen and failed. The story of the Voynich manuscript in modern times is not just the story of a book. It is the story of the people who devoted themselves to it, who placed their minds, their reputations, and sometimes even their sanity upon its silent altar. If the manuscript is a mirror, then the reflection it has given back for over a century is of obsession, frustration, and longing. And so we step into the 20th and 21st centuries, where scholars, scientists, and amateurs alike fell into its pages, only to discover that leaving was far harder than entering. When Wilfred Voynich first unveiled the manuscript in 1912, he believed, perhaps naively, that it would take only a few years for the world's brightest minds to decode it. Europe was filled with philologists and cryptographers, men and women, who delighted in puzzles and prided themselves on deciphering forgotten tongues. Yet as the decades slipped by, that optimism soured. One by one, the brightest lights flickered against the book's darkness, their efforts dissolving into silence. In the early days, the manuscript was passed among university circles like an intellectual dare. Latinists scanned the script, certain they could find familiar roots. Historians looked for parallels in medieval herbal manuscripts, certain that they had seen these leaves before somewhere in the margins of another codex. But every comparison collapsed. Plants that looked at first glance almost recognizable revealed twisted stems, leaves that refused botanical classification, blossoms that belonged to no earthly species. Language that seemed structured and purposeful revealed no Rosetta Stone, no clue to crack its syntax. As the 20th century matured, so too did the seriousness of the scholars who took up the manuscript. Among them was William Newbold, a respected professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1919, Newbold announced with confidence that he had solved the riddle. His method, however, was extraordinary. He believed that each letter in the manuscript concealed microscopic shorthand symbols written by means of a magnifying lens, centuries before such technology was known. These symbols, when properly interpreted, revealed profound philosophical and scientific secrets, allegedly authored by none other than Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar. For a brief and dazzling moment, Newbold's theory captured imaginations. Newspapers heralded his breakthrough, academics listened politely to his lectures, and the manuscript's reputation soared. But like all supposed solutions, it collapsed under scrutiny. Colleagues realized that Newbold's microscopic symbols were nothing more than cracks in the parchment fibers, meaningless accidents mistaken for hidden code. After Newbold's death, his theory was quietly dismissed, leaving the manuscript still mute, and his name tarnished. This pattern would repeat itself again and again: the surge of excitement, the heady rush of discovery, the declaration of victory, followed by the slow unraveling, the disappointment, and the retreat into silence. Scholars who had once stood proudly at podiums eventually withdrew embarrassed, their careers scarred by their closeness to a mystery that refused resolution. The mid-20th century brought a new wave of interpreters, this time armed with the growing science of cryptography. During World War II, the Allies had cracked the Enigma code, a cipher thought unbreakable. The men and women who had bent their lives to the task of wartime code-breaking now looked at the Voynich manuscript with curiosity. Surely, if they could dismantle Nazi communications, they could unravel the secrets of one old book. William Friedman, one of the greatest cryptanalysts of his age, was among those who tried. Friedman and his team at the U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service applied mathematical rigor, statistical models, and computer analysis. For years, they searched for patterns that might reveal a cipher system, a linguistic skeleton, a method beneath the madness. Yet the book gave nothing. After decades, Friedman admitted defeat. He concluded reluctantly that the manuscript's script might not be a code at all, but rather an elaborate hoax, a meaningless string of symbols designed to mimic language without conveying anything at all. It was a bitter conclusion, one that haunted him in his later years, for it meant that his life's brilliance had collided with a puzzle that may have been empty from the start. But not everyone agreed with Friedman's resignation. To others, the idea of a meaningless hoax felt too cynical, too dismissive of the manuscript's palpable strangeness. If it were a hoax, why was it so carefully structured? Why did the words follow rules of repetition and variation? Why did they conform to statistical properties of real languages? Why, above all, would someone spend years crafting hundreds of pages of meticulous nonsense? The possibility of emptiness felt, in its own, way more disturbing than the possibility of meaning. The late 20th century gave rise to a different breed of scholars, outsiders, enthusiasts, and eccentrics, who believed that they, unlike academics bound by convention, could see the truth. Some approached the book with the fervor of prophets. One claimed it was written in a form of shorthand Latin. Another insisted it was a lost Asian language disguised in European script. Each theory sparkled for a season, drawing brief attention before fading, disproven, or ignored. The arrival of the internet only widened the circle. Now anyone with an interest could download images of the manuscript, pore over its symbols, and declare themselves a cryptographer. Forums buzzed with debates, rival theories, and passionate arguments. The manuscript had become not just a puzzle, but a stage, a place where egos clashed, where amateurs sparred with experts, where obsession bloomed in public view. For every thoughtful analysis, there were dozens of eccentric claims, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Some saw the manuscript as an alchemical text. Others declared it a guide to extraterrestrial communication. The mystery, once confined to libraries and lecture halls, now belonged to the entire world. And yet, amid all the noise, the manuscript itself remained silent. It did not bend to the will of scholars or amateurs, of cryptographers or dreamers. It absorbed their efforts, their theories, their lives, and gave nothing in return. The silence of the book became a kind of presence, a shadow that loomed over those who dared to confront it. Some found themselves unable to let go. Careers withered as professors, spent too much time chasing answers, their academic credibility eroded by association with the unsolvable. Obsession is rarely rewarded in the halls of academia, and the manuscript seemed to demand nothing less than total devotion. What is it, then, about the manuscript that does this? Why does it draw minds so deeply into its labyrinth, only to leave them lost? Perhaps it is because the human mind cannot bear a riddle without an answer. We are pattern-seeking creatures, trained by evolution to find meaning, to connect dots even where none exist. The Voynich manuscript offers just enough structure to tantalize that instinct. Its script looks like language. Its pages look like knowledge. Its diagrams look like explanations. But every time meaning seems close, it evaporates. To study the book is to be forever on the edge of understanding, with no resolution in sight. And so the descent of the scholars is not only into the manuscript but into themselves. Each page forces a confrontation with the limits of human intellect, with the possibility that some things are not meant to be understood, or that meaning itself may be a construct we are imposing, not discovering. The frustration that emerges is more than academic. It is existential. For what does it say about us if we can map the human genome, send rockets to other planets, and yet still fail to understand a single stubborn book? The manuscript in its silence humbles us. It reminds us that knowledge is not inevitable, that human progress is not guaranteed to answer every question. Some mysteries remain untouched, waiting, or perhaps refusing to be solved. The scholars who descended into its depths were not fools, nor were they failures. They were explorers in a wilderness where the map dissolves as you walk it. They carried torches into a cave that may have no end. And yet, there is something almost beautiful in their struggle, for in their obsession, their heartbreak, their shattered theories, they left behind a record of humanity's hunger for meaning. They showed us how far we are willing to go to wrestle with the unknown, how much we are willing to risk for the possibility of understanding. Their descent is tragic, yes, but also noble. The book still sits today in the Yale University Library, under glass, its pages digitized and spread across the internet. Anyone can look at it now. Anyone can step into the labyrinth. And new scholars do every year. Some bring the latest tools of machine learning, artificial intelligence, or computational linguistics. Others bring their own eccentric brilliance, convinced that they alone will succeed where centuries have failed. The descent continues, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of the manuscript, not the words on its pages, but the endless pursuit it inspires. Like a mirage in the desert, it leads us forward, even if the oasis is never found. For in chasing it, we discover not only the limits of our knowledge, but also the depths of our desire to know. The descent is ongoing. The story has not ended. The next chapter beckons us into the heart of speculation, into the wide-open field of theories that range from the rational to the unimaginable. If the scholars could not solve it, perhaps the storytellers can. Perhaps the truth lies not in certainty, but in the unthinkable. When a mystery endures for centuries, it breeds not only scholarship but imagination. The Voynich manuscript has resisted every attempt at explanation, and in doing so it has become a canvas, one on which generation after generation has painted their theories, wild or sober, elegant or absurd. If scholars in their libraries could not solve it, then perhaps storytellers in their armchairs might. The book is no longer simply a codex of ink and vellum. It's a field of speculation where hypotheses bloom like the strange flowers drawn inside its pages. Each theory carries within it a fragment of hope, that this time finally the veil might be pierced. And so we step into the gallery of possibilities, where each idea stands like a sculpture in half-light, inviting us to walk around it, admire its strangeness and wonder, if perhaps this is the truth we've been seeking. One of the earliest theories, whispered even in the first decades after its rediscovery, is that the manuscript represents a forgotten language. Imagine it, a tongue once spoken by a small community, flourishing perhaps in the mountains of Europe, or the coasts of the Mediterranean, preserved nowhere else but here. In this vision, the book becomes a time capsule, the last breath of a people whose voices were otherwise lost to history. Linguists have long toyed with this idea, tracing the rhythms of the script, noting that the patterns of repetition and word length resemble those of natural languages. Could it be that the book is not encrypted at all, but simply written in an extinct idiom we no longer recognize? Some argue that the structure feels too neat, too statistically grounded to be pure invention. Yet the stumbling block remains. Without any bilingual key, without any Rosetta Stone, how could such a language a verb recovered? It is like listening to music without knowing the scale, recognizing the rhythm but never the melody. Others take this further and suggest that the language may not have been entirely lost, but deliberately hidden. Perhaps it is a cipher layered over a natural tongue, one designed to conceal sacred or secret knowledge. Medieval Europe was filled with hidden societies, alchemists, heretical sects, and mystics who cloaked their writings in symbols to protect themselves from persecution. Might the manuscript be the artifact of one such group? The elaborate illustrations of plants and stars could then serve as a veil, distracting the uninitiated while guiding the initiated toward truths they alone could understand. This theory paints the book as an initiatory text, its secrecy essential to its power. But if that is so, who were the keepers of this knowledge? And why has every effort to decode it left us with nothing but frustration? Then there are those who suggest that the book is no secret code, but a hoax, a trick designed to deceive. According to this theory, the Voynich manuscript was crafted to appear profound while meaning nothing at all. A 16th century forger, perhaps, might have inked its pages to sell to a wealthy but gullible patron. The elaborate illustrations of imaginary plants, the careful but meaningless script, the false aura of mystery, all of it could have been a clever scam, a way to conjure value out of nothing. Certainly the history of rare manuscripts is littered with such frauds. The theory has a kind of brutal elegance. If the book is nonsense, then all the centuries of speculation dissolve at once. But here too doubts creep in. Why would a hoaxer go to such extraordinary lengths? The manuscript is hundreds of pages long, with consistent handwriting and complex diagrams. To sustain such a fraud would have required years of labor, all for the uncertain reward of tricking one buyer. A hoax of such scale begins to seem less like deception and more like madness. From hoaxes, the theories slide into stranger territories. Some claim that the book originates not from Europe at all, but from a lost civilization. Perhaps it was written by survivors of Atlantis, preserving fragments of knowledge from a world drowned in myth. Others link it to ancient Mesoamerican cultures, noting that some of its plants bear faint resemblance to species from the New World unknown to Europe before Columbus. Could it be that the manuscript is a relic of contact, evidence of transoceanic encounters centuries before history admits them? Such theories are intoxicating, for they promise to rewrite not just the story of a book, but the story of the world. To hold the Voynich manuscript would then be to touch the hand of a vanished people, their voice echoing across the gulf of time. But perhaps the most unsettling theories lift us beyond the earth itself. What if the manuscript is not of human origin at all? Its stars, half familiar and half alien, might be charts of a sky not seen from our planet. Its plants, twisted cousins of earthly flora, could be sketches of vegetation on another world. The women in their green baths might be depictions of biology utterly foreign to us, a physiology drawn through eyes not human. Could it be that the Voynich manuscript is a kind of message, left by travelers not of this earth, encoded in forms that mimic but do not quite replicate our own? To entertain such an idea is to step across the threshold of science into myth, yet the manuscript seems to invite such audacity. It is too strange, too resistant, too otherworldly to dismiss such speculation outright. There is, too, the possibility that the book was not written to be read in the way we expect. Perhaps its text is not linguistic at all, but visual, a notation system for music, movement, or ritual. Imagine the script not as words but as choreography, each symbol a gesture or a chant, a sequence performed rather than spoken. The bathing women could then be stages of a rite, the stars not maps of the heavens, but points in a dance of the soul. In this light, the manuscript is less a book than a score, waiting for the right performers to bring it to life. Such a theory stretches our definitions of language, but perhaps that is exactly what the manuscript demands, a willingness to step beyond categories to imagine communication in modes we have long since forgotten. And then there is the dreamlike idea that the manuscript may be a product of the unconscious. Could a single person, working in solitude, have invented the entire language and imagery as a private world, a diary of imagination rather than communication? The human mind is capable of astonishing invention. There are documented cases of invented languages, complex and consistent, created by individuals for no one but themselves. Perhaps the manuscript is the record of such a vision, a garden cultivated entirely within one mind. To read it would then be impossible, for it was never meant to be read. It was meant only to exist, as proof that the inner worlds of imagination can spill into ink and vellum. Theories multiply endlessly, each as captivating as the last. Some see in its pages encoded recipes for medicine, alchemical formulas for eternal life, or even a manual for time travel. Others claim it is an elaborate piece of medieval art, a surrealist masterpiece centuries before surrealism, designed not to explain, but to astonish. A few even suggest that the manuscript is not complete, that it requires some external device, a lens or a mirror, without which the text remains invisible. It is as though the book generates its own mythology, every theory another branch sprouting from its mysterious trunk. Yet woven through all these possibilities is a deeper truth. The manuscript does not merely resist explanation, it provokes imagination. It invites us to think the unthinkable, to stretch the boundaries of plausibility, to dwell in the space where history dissolves into story. In this way, it has become less a puzzle to be solved and more a myth to be lived with, a riddle whose power lies not in its solution, but in its endurance. And now, in our own century, a new kind of theory emerges, one that looks not to the past or the stars, but to the frontiers of intelligence itself. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, neural networks, these tools now pore over the Voynich, manuscript analyzing its structure with precision. No human mind can match. Some whisper that perhaps the book was never meant for us at all, but for a different kind of reader, one not bound by human cognition. What if it is a text written for machines, centuries before machines existed? Or what if it was produced by something like a machine, a non-human intelligence, ancient or alien, leaving behind a message we cannot pass because we were never its intended audience? This is the final dizzying turn, that the Voynich manuscript is not merely a relic of history, but a signpost pointing beyond human limits. To read it may require not just better scholars or stronger computers, but a new form of mind altogether. Perhaps only an intelligence other than our own will ever unlock its secrets. And if that is true, then the book becomes not simply mysterious, but prophetic, a text awaiting the future to finally find its voice. There are moments when staring at the Voynich manuscript for too long that something uncanny begins to happen. At first, the pages seem merely strange, inked plants that have never grown in any garden, constellations of stars that look half familiar and half invented, looping sentences written in a script no one can read. But the longer one studies it, the more the book itself begins to feel alive. Its patterns repeat with eerie precision, its words circling back like echoes in a cavern. The human eye, so desperate for meaning, begins to sense intention. And then, the question slips into the mind, what if this book was not written by us? What if the hand that created it belonged to a mind not like ours? This is a possibility both terrifying and tantalizing. We are accustomed to imagining mysteries as human, puzzles, codes designed by clever cryptographers, dialects belonging to forgotten tribes, or elaborate hoaxes drawn up by tricksters with too much time. But what if the manuscript does not fit into any of these categories because it was never meant to? What if its very alienness is the point? To contemplate this is to drift into unsettling territory, where the familiar boundaries of human cognition blur and we stand at the edge of something vast, strange and unclassifiable. Consider, for example, the patterns of the text itself. Cryptographers have long noted that the Voynich script has statistical properties uncannily similar to those of natural languages. Words cluster, repeat, and vary in ways that suggest underlying grammar. Yet when examined closely, the rules of this grammar do not match any language we know. The text seems to operate like language, but not as we understand it, like a reflection in a distorted mirror. Some researchers have suggested that the manuscript may have been produced not by deliberate encoding, but by an algorithmic process, something rule-bound and mechanical. In this sense, the book anticipates the very logic of artificial intelligence, a system generating text that is coherent in form but not in meaning, at least not to us. It is chilling to imagine that centuries ago, long before computers, someone, or something, might have produced an artifact that resembles machine-generated text. The looping, repetitive structures, the way phrases seem to evolve slightly across pages, the curious balance of order and chaos, it all feels strangely modern. To some eyes, the Voynich manuscript does not look like the work of a medieval monk, but like the output of a system. Could it be that the book is the product of a kind of proto-algorithm, an attempt to simulate language itself? Or could it be that it was generated by a mind whose very cognition operates differently, one that thinks in patterns, beyond the reach of our logic? There are theories, whispered at the edges of academia, that the manuscript may represent an attempt by an unknown intelligence to communicate, but not in a way we were meant to understand directly. Imagine a mind so different from ours that translation is impossible, a mind that does not think in linear sentences, but in recursive spirals, diagrams, and layered associations. To such a mind, the pages of the Voynich manuscript might be perfectly clear, a simple and natural record of knowledge. To us, however, it becomes an impenetrable labyrinth. What if we are not the intended audience at all? This possibility forces us to consider what we mean by language and meaning. For humans, language is both a tool and a mirror shaped by the needs of survival and the contours of our brains. But there may be other architectures of thought, other forms of cognition that do not map neatly onto ours. Bees dance to communicate direction, whales sing across oceans, octopuses change color to signal intent. Their languages are not like ours, and yet they work perfectly within their worlds. Could the Voynich manuscript be the fossil of such a system, evidence of a non-human mind preserved in ink and vellum? And then the speculation grows darker still. Some have suggested that the manuscript might not merely reflect another kind of cognition, but that it could itself be alive in some sense, an autonomous creation. The patterns of its text are so internally consistent that some scholars have half-jokingly compared it to the output of a biological organism, as if the writing were the growth rings of a tree or the shell of a nautilus. In this view, the manuscript is not a message but a manifestation, something generated rather than written, a text grown rather than composed. The thought is enough to make one shiver, a book that writes itself, endlessly unfolding its secrets, yet never yielding them. But even more haunting is the idea that the manuscript is an artifact of cognition unmoored from humanity altogether, a glimpse into the mental architecture of something that is not us. When one lingers on the images of the bathing women, connected by pipes and pools in what seems like some strange biological machine, the sensation grows that we are glimpsing a worldview alien to our own. These illustrations are too specific to be random doodles, too elaborate to be meaningless, yet they describe processes that do not exist in our world, at least not as we understand them. What mind, then, conceived them? Was it an attempt to map unseen forces, energies, or anatomies invisible to us, or was it the everyday reality of another kind of being, recorded in the only way it knew how? There is something especially unsettling in the thought that the manuscript might be both utterly logical and utterly opaque. To the intelligence that produced it, every word and symbol might be precise, every drawing a faithful record of reality. We are the ones who fail to see, the ones blind to its structure. To us it looks like madness, to its creator it was sense. The gap between those perspectives is terrifying because it hints at the limits of our understanding. It whispers that the human mind, for all its brilliance, may not be the measure of all things. The rise of artificial intelligence in our own era only sharpens this unease. For the first time, we can witness non-human systems generating text, images, and structures that look human but are not. AI models can produce convincing prose that flows like natural language while remaining devoid of lived experience. They can generate fantastical plants and impossible diagrams at the click of a button. When scholars compare the Voynich manuscript to the output of modern AI, the resemblance is uncanny. Could it be that the book is a medieval foreshadowing of machine cognition? Or, more unsettling still, that it is evidence of some prior encounter with a non-human intelligence, whether biological or artificial, whose traces linger in vellum and ink? If we follow this path too far, the questions become dizzying. What if the book was not written on Earth at all? What if it is the artifact of contact passed down through hidden channels until it surfaced in a 17th century library? Or what if it is less an object from elsewhere than a mirror held up to us, reflecting the limits of our comprehension? Perhaps the manuscript reveals not an alien mind, but the unsettling truth that we cannot always decode the products of minds too unlike our own, even when they are human. Because here lies the final sobering possibility that the manuscript is indeed of human origin, but that it emerged from the margins of human cognition. Perhaps it was created by a savant, someone whose mind worked according to rules unfamiliar to others. History is filled with examples of individuals who produced systems of symbols, elaborate cosmologies, or invented languages that baffled everyone else. The manuscript could be one such creation, the private world of a singular genius who thought in ways we cannot reconstruct. In this case, the non-human quality of the book would not reflect extraterrestrials or machines, but the outer reaches of our own species' mental landscape. To contemplate this is no less unsettling, for it forces us to admit that within humanity itself are modes of thought so alien they might as well belong to another species. And so we circle back, drawn once again toward Earth. For all the dizzying speculation, for all the whispers of alien minds, self-writing books and AI before its time, there remains the simple fact that the manuscript is ink on vellum, produced by human hands in a human era. Its drawings, however strange, follow conventions of medieval illustration. Its materials are consistent with early modern Europe. Whatever its mysteries, it is bound in the flesh of animals, marked by quills dipped in ink. It may be the product of genius or madness, imagination or obsession, but it is, at least in its material form, human. And yet, even as we acknowledge this, the unease lingers. Because to look at the Voynich manuscript is still to feel the presence of a mind not like ours, pressing through the pages, staring back across the centuries. Whether that mind belonged to some other species, some machine before its time, or simply a human being whose thoughts moved in alien currents, we cannot know. What we can say is that the manuscript holds a mirror to our deepest fears and fascinations, that we are not the only form of intelligence, and that the boundaries of thought are wider, stranger, and more unfathomable than we dare believe. For all the dreamlike speculation surrounding the Voynich manuscript, theories of alien languages, invented worlds, or minds unlike our own, there remains the stubborn physical reality of the object itself. It is not a ghost, not a hallucination, not a digital phantom. It is a book. It can be touched, weighed, smelled. Its pages are animal skin, its drawings layered in pigments ground from minerals and plants, its writing laid down in ink by a hand that once trembled with the imperfections of muscle and bone. For centuries, mystery has clouded the meaning of the manuscript, but when modern science finally set its instruments upon it, the material body of the book began to speak in a different way. The most decisive revelations came in 2009, when a team at the University of Arizona performed radiocarbon dating on several samples of the parchment. Using accelerator mass spectrometry, they were able to measure the ratio of carbon isotopes which decay over time at a predictable rate. The results were strikingly consistent. The vellum of the manuscript dates to the early 15th century, specifically between 1404 and 1438. This discovery alone shattered many theories. For years, some had argued that the book was a clever 16th or 17th century forgery, a hoax designed to swindle wealthy collectors. Others had speculated that it was an 18th or even 19th century invention. The radiocarbon data closed these doors. Whatever the Voynich manuscript is, it is not modern. It belongs to the age of Gothic cathedrals, alchemical laboratories, and the earliest stirrings of the Renaissance. This finding anchored the manuscript firmly in history, but it also deepened the enigma. For if the book was made in the early 1400s, then who in Thatera could have written such a thing? The script bears no resemblance to known medieval alphabets. The drawings of plants and astronomical charts have no clear counterpart in the botanical or cosmological texts of the time. And yet, the book's construction is entirely consistent with the craft of European manuscript making. The vellum is carefully prepared calfskin, its surface scraped and polished until smooth. The ruling of the lines, faint but visible under magnification, suggests careful planning. The quill strokes betray the familiar rhythm of a scribe trained in calligraphy. The pigments used for the illustrations include copper-based greens, iron, gall ink and azurite blues, all materials available in Europe during the 15th century. In other words, The book is authentically medieval in body, even as its mind appears to belong elsewhere. The paradox is unsettling. On one hand, the material analysis strips away some of the wilder theories. The book is not a product of extraterrestrial craft, nor is it a 20th century joke. On the other, the dating forces us to confront the implausibility of its content within the context of the 15th century. The Europe of that age was a world of illuminated psalters, devotional books, and herbal manuals. Their codex filled with entirely unknown plants, indecipherable writing, and nude women bathing in green pools simply does not fit. It is as though the object belongs to two worlds at once, the medieval in flesh, the unplaceable in spirit. Further, chemical analysis of the ink confirmed its consistency with the parchment's date. Scientists at the McCrone Research Institute in Chicago, using techniques such as Raman spectroscopy and polarized light microscopy, identified the ink as iron gall, the standard writing medium of the period. The pigments showed no trace of modern compounds, eliminating the possibility of later forgery. Even the quill strokes themselves betray subtle irregularities of hand, hesitations at line breaks, minute tremors at corners, that prove they were written by a living scribe, not stamped by any mechanical device. Each line, for all its strange beauty, is undeniably the work of a human hand pressing ink into skin. This human touch makes the manuscript both more real and more uncanny. To imagine a person, perhaps a monk in a candlelit scriptorium or a wandering scholar hunched over a desk, dipping a quill and inscribing line after line of meaningless words is almost unbearable. How long would it have taken? Hundreds of pages, thousands upon thousands of glyphs, each one carefully executed. This was no idle doodling. It was labor, patience, and intention. Whoever created the Voynich manuscript did so with devotion. But devotion to what? Some have suggested that the very choice of vellum may hold clues. Parchment was expensive, the product of painstaking work that required slaughtering animals, stretching and scraping their hides, and preparing them for writing. The Voynich manuscript contains over 200 pages, meaning an entire herd of calves may have been sacrificed for its creation. No one would have invested such resources lightly. This was not a casual notebook, it was a project of immense cost. Whatever purpose it served, it mattered deeply to someone. Even the binding tells a story. Thought a current cover is later added. During its long passage through collectors' hands, the sewing holes and quire structure reveal how the book was originally assembled. It was not a jumble of random pages, but a carefully arranged codex designed to be read, or at least looked through in sequence. Its organization, though baffling tous, was deliberate. In this sense, the manuscript is a machine of meaning, one whose gears we cannot see. And yet, the science that grounds the manuscript in the 15th century only sharpens its contradictions. For example, the plant illustrations bear little resemblance to any known European herbals of the period. Medieval botanicals, such as the Herbarium Apulei or the texts of Dioscorides, drew recognizable plants with medicinal uses. The Voynich plants, by contrast, are hybrids, their roots twisting into impossible knots, their leaves combining forms from different species, their flowers blooming in geometries unknown to nature. To a medieval reader, they would have been as strange as they are to us. So why create them? Was the manuscript intended for a private audience, a secret society, or perhaps as an elaborate cipher for real knowledge disguised in fantasy? The astronomical section raises similar puzzles. The star charts include zodiacal symbols recognizable from medieval astrology, the ram, the bull, the fish. But surrounding them are wheels and diagrams filled with stars that do not correspond to any known constellation. Radiocarbon dating tells us the book was made at a time when European astronomy was still bound to Ptolemaic models of the cosmos, yet these diagrams suggest a vision that is both familiar and utterly foreign. It is as though the manuscript is a palimpsest of two realities, one rooted in the medieval world, the other drifting beyond it. Perhaps most eerie of all are the human figures, the women in the pools and pipes. Painted in pale greens and blues, they look almost playful at first, like figures from a medieval marginalia. But their sheer number, Their arrangement into complex diagrams and the fact that no text explains them transforms them into something more unsettling. Radiocarbon dating assures us that these women were drawn in the 1400s. But what mind in that? Era conceived of them. What purpose did they serve? Scientific analysis also raises the specter of lost context. The parchment tells us when the manuscript was made, but not who wrote it, or where, or why. The ink tells us it was genuine, but not what the words mean. The material certainty throws the absence of meaning into sharper relief. It is as if we have a body without a soul, a corpse without a name. The Voynich manuscript exists, undeniably, but its existence only intensifies the question of its intent. Some skeptics, confronted with this, argue that the book must be a hoax. Perhaps it was created in the 15th century as a deliberate piece of nonsense designed to trick or amuse. Yet this explanation falters before their scale of the project. Who, in that age, would waste such precious resources to produce hundreds of pages of gibberish? And why illustrate them with such care, with pigments as costly as azurite? The hoax theory satisfies skepticism but collapses under scrutiny. The effort required simply outweighs the payoff. Others point to the possibility of a cipher, an encrypted text concealing genuine knowledge. The 15th century was indeed a time when secret writing flourished, as scholars and alchemists hid their discoveries from rivals or from the church, but despite centuries of attempts, no one has cracked the code. The patterns of the text behave like language, but no key has unlocked it. Could it be a code so brilliant that it has resisted analysis for 600 years? Or could it be that our assumptions about how to read it are themselves flawed? In the key, and the science of ink and skin does not solve the mystery, it sharpens it. We know when the book was made, what it was made of and how it was assembled, but none of this tells us why. Instead, the radiocarbon dating creates a stark contrast. The book is medieval in material, yet timeless in strangeness. It anchors the manuscript in the early 1400s, but in doing so, it throws into question the very history it inhabits. The Voynich manuscript is not outside time, it is a wound inside it, a scar that refuses to heal. And so we step back, holding both the certainty of science and the abyss of meaninglessness in our hands. The parchment dates to the early 15th century. The ink is consistent with that date. The drawings were made then, not later. A human hand in that age created this book, and yet the book remains opaque, unyielding, as if mocking our efforts to understand. Its body is medieval, but its soul belongs elsewhere. This realization pushes us toward a broader horizon. The Voynich manuscript is not the only book to haunt history. There are other lost works, other manuscripts that have slipped beyond comprehension. Grimoires filled with impossible spells, codices recording vanished civilizations, texts burned, scattered, or written in scripts no one can read. The Voynich, in its stubborn materiality, belongs to this greater family of spectral books, half real and half dream. To understand it, we may need to compare it to these other orphans of history, these volumes that have become monuments not of knowledge, but of mystery. When we stand before the Voynich manuscript, it feels singular, almost alien in its loneliness. Its pages resist us, its script curls away from meaning, its images shimmer with half-familiarity. Yet the deeper we wander into the labyrinth of lost knowledge, the more we realize the Voynich is not alone. Across history, books have appeared that speak in riddles, vanish into secrecy, or leave behind fragments that defy explanation. They belong to what might be called a library of shadows, a vast scattered tradition of manuscripts that refuse to be fully understood, or that hint at truths their creators may have meant never to be spoken aloud. To place the Voynich within, this library is to expand its mystery outward, to see it as one among a chorus of whispering texts, each telling us something about the human hunger for knowledge and the equally human fear of it. Perhaps the most direct relative to the Voynich is the Book of Soyga, also known as Aldaraya. This 16th century volume belonged to the Elizabethan mathematician and magician John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I and seeker of angelic communication. Dee believed the book contained arcane wisdom, a mix of astronomy, magic squares, and invocations. Yet there was one section, 36 pages of tables filled with letters that defied even his formidable intellect. Dee turned to his scryer, Edward Kelly, to summon the Archangel Uriel and ask for help. According to Dee's notes, the angel explained that only Michael himself could truly interpret the book, and only under particular spiritual conditions. For centuries, the Book of Soiga vanished, known only through Dee's references. Then, in the 1990s, 2 copies were rediscovered in the British Library and the Bodleian Library. Even today, much of it remains undeciphered. Like the Voynich, it teases the boundary between sense and nonsense, wisdom and madness. If the Book of Soiga belongs to the world of occult scholarship, the Ripley Scroll belongs to the fevered imagination of alchemy. Dating to the 15th and 16th centuries, these vast ornate scrolls, some stretching over 6 meters long, depict strange allegorical images surrounding the quest for the philosopher's stone. Naked figures emerge from alchemical vessels. Dragons devour themselves. Suns and moons merge in cosmic weddings. Attributed to the English alchemist George Ripley, the scrolls are less practical manuals than symbolic labyrinths, each image demanding interpretation. To read them is to wander through a dreamscape where chemistry and mysticism blur. Like the Voynich manuscript, the Ripley Scrolls remind us that medieval and Renaissance intellectual life was not neatly divided into science and superstition, but rather thrived in the spaces where both converged. Still more elusive are texts that have disappeared entirely, leaving behind only their names and the rumors surrounding them. The Sibylline books of ancient Rome were among the most revered and most secret. According to legend, they were acquired by King Tarquinius Superbus from a mysterious woman who offered him 9 prophetic scrolls. When he refused her price, she burned 3, then 3 more, until he purchased the last 3 at the original cost. Kept in the Temple of Jupiter, these oracles were consulted in times of crisis by specially appointed priests. For centuries they guided the fate of Rome, until they were destroyed in a fire in 83 BCE. Replacements were later gathered, but the originals were gone, their prophecies swallowed by time. The Sibylline books haunt history as a reminder of knowledge, deliberately hidden and lost, their power lying precisely in their absence. Another member of this library is the Book of Thoth, a legendary Egyptian text said to contain the secrets of the gods, the ability to speak with animals, to command the Gi, elements to see the heavens themselves. According to stories recorded in the Setna Kamwastales, the book was hidden in a series of nested coffins beneath the Nile, guarded by serpents and divine curses. To read it was to risk destruction, for its wisdom could overwhelm human minds. Whether or not it ever existed as a physical volume, the Book of Thoth represents the archetype of forbidden knowledge, a work so powerful it cannot safely be held. It casts its shadow forward into all later tales of dangerous books, from medieval grimoires to modern fantasies. Closer to the world of scholars, we encounter the Codex Serafinianus, a 20th century creation by the Italian artist Luigi Serafini. At first glance, it seems a modern echo of the Voynich manuscript, an encyclopedia of an imaginary world filled with bizarre plants, impossible machines, and surreal rituals, all described in an invented script no one has ever deciphered. Serafini himself has explained that the writing is deliberately asemic without semantic content, meant to evoke the feeling of being a child confronted with a book one cannot read. Though a modern art project, the Codex reveals how deeply the motif of unreadable books runs through human imagination. The fact that it is so often compared to the Voynich manuscript suggests that we crave such enigmas, even when we know their origin. But not all shadow texts are artistic exercises. Some were clearly meant to conceal dangerous or heretical knowledge. The Picatrix, a vast Arabic grimoire translated into Latin in the 13th century, blends astrology, magic, and philosophy in a dense labyrinth of spells and correspondences. It instructs on how to harness planetary powers, summon spirits, and channel celestial forces. To a medieval reader, the book offered both wisdom and peril. To study it was to risk accusations of sorcery, yet its promises of power were irresistible. The Picatrix, though not lost, remains a work of shadows, one foot in scholarship, one in taboo. The Necronomicon, though fictional, belongs to this lineage as well. Invented by H.P. Lovecraft in the 20th century, it was described as a forbidden tome filled with the lore of cosmic horrors, written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. What is striking is how quickly readers believed in it. Publishers received requests for copies, forged editions were printed, libraries were asked if they had it in their collections. The Necronomicon became real in imagination, its shadow falling backward across the history of occult books. In this sense, Lovecraft tapped into the same human fascination that makes the Voynich so powerful. The belief that somewhere, hidden, there is a book that reveals too much. And then there are books that are lost, not because they never existed, but because history itself consumed them. In 1562, the Spanish friar Diego de Landa ordered the burning of countless Maya codices, declaring them works of the devil. Only 4 authenticated pre-Columbian codices survive today, fragments of a vast tradition of writing and knowledge that once spanned an entire civilization. The destruction is incalculable. We can only imagine what sciences, histories, or mythologies were incinerated in those flames. In this context, the Voynich manuscript acquires a new resonance. It is not only a mystery, but a survivor. It has endured where countless others were erased. The pattern emerges: books that hide, books that deceive, books that are destroyed, and books that speak in languages no one can understand. Together they form a library not of enlightenment, but of twilight. A library that runs parallel to the great canon of human learning, always haunting it. For every Aristotle or Newton there is a Soyga or a Voynich. For every Bible, a Sibylline prophecy lost to fire. These are the counterpoints to our libraries of light, reminding us that knowledge is never complete, that every page turned is shadowed by countless pages missing. Placing the Voynich manuscript within this tradition makes it both less lonely and more profound. It is not a singular aberration, but part of a pattern stretching across cultures and centuries. The persistent idea that there exists knowledge forbidden, concealed, or too strange to survive. The Voynich is remarkable not only for its indecipherability, but for its endurance. Unlike the Sibylline books, it was not destroyed. Unlike the Book of Thoth, it is not purely myth. Unlike the Codex Seraphinianus, it is not a modern invention. It exists physically from the 15th century, an anchor in history even as it floats free of meaning. And yet this comparison also returns us to its uniqueness. The Ripley Scroll, for all its wild imagery, is clearly allegorical. The Book of Soyga, for all its puzzles, belongs to the traditions of Renaissance occultism. The Sibylline books, for all their secrecy, were oracles rooted in Roman religion. But the Voynich manuscript remains uncategorized. It is neither purely magical nor purely scientific, neither clearly hoax nor clearly scripture. It is a book that resists classification, even among other mysterious books. In the Library of Shadows, it sits at the center, the most opaque of them all. The thought is chilling. If so many other texts could vanish, burned, buried, or forgotten, what does it mean that the Voynich survived? Was it preserved by chance or by design? Did its guardians through the centuries recognize its strangeness, or did they simply fail to understand it? Each turn of its history seems to echo the larger fate of lost knowledge, survival balanced on the knife edge of accident. In the end, the Library of Shadows tells us something essential about ourselves. We are creatures who crave knowledge but also fear it, who preserve books yet burn them, who invent texts that do not exist and grieve for texts we will never read. The Voynich manuscript is a mirror of this paradox. It is both precious and meaningless, enduring and unreadable, a survivor and an orphan. By setting it among the other lost and forbidden books of history, we see not only its strangeness, but our own. And so we circle back, through Rome's lost prophecies, Egypt's hidden coffins, England's alchemical scrolls, and Dee's angelic invocations, until we return to that single codex bound in calfskin. The Voynich manuscript, sitting quietly in its library vault, is not just one mystery among many. It is the lens through which all these shadows converge. Other lost books may whisper from the dark, but the Voynich still lies open, its pages waiting. The Voynich manuscript has always been more than ink and parchment. To open its pages is to open a doorway, not necessarily into its world, but into ours. For across 6 centuries, every set of eyes that has fallen upon it has seen not only the curling glyphs and impossible plants, but also themselves reflected back in secret shapes. The book does not move, it does not change, and yet it seems to morph with every era that touches it. It is a mirror, a silent surface upon which human obsession, fear and desire are projected, century after century. To trace its history is not only to ask what the manuscript is, but also to ask who we have been in the long span of time since its creation. When the Jesuits handled it in the 17th century, the manuscript was filtered through the ages' obsessions with forbidden knowledge, heresy, and hidden wisdom. For them it was not merely a puzzle but a danger, something to be concealed, a text that might whisper unorthodox truths too powerful for ordinary eyes. It reflected their world of censorship and inquisition, of suspicion that beneath every strange line of ink lurked a threat to the Church's fragile control. To these guardians of orthodoxy, the manuscript was a cipher of temptation, a book that had to be hidden because it might say what was never meant to be spoken. Centuries later, in the hands of Wilfrid Voynich in 1912, it became something else, entirely. For him, the book did not whisper of heresy but of discovery. He lived in a world of adventure and scholarship, where lost manuscripts promised fame and fortune, and where the rediscovery of forgotten knowledge could rewrite history. To him, the Voynich manuscript reflected ambition and romance, an unrepeatable moment when a man could stumble upon a relic of untold importance. He saw in it the mirror of his own desire to stand on the threshold of revelation. Toehold it was to imagine himself as the one who would unlock its secrets, and in unlocking them, write his own name into the story of civilization. Then came the 20th century's soldiers, spies, and cryptographers. To them, the book became not romance but battle. They stared at its glyphs through the lens of war, believing that if only they cracked the code, they might unlock intelligence, strategy, or the secrets of another nation. Their world was defined by ciphers, radio transmissions, and secret communications, and so the manuscript reflected their anxieties, turning itself in their minds into a weapon disguised as a book. When it refused to yield, it was not only a manuscript. Resisting translation, it was an enemy outwitting them, a taunting reminder of unsolved codes and unreadable signals. And now, in our digital age, the manuscript reflects yet another set of obsessions. We see in it not heresy, not discovery, not intelligent secrets, but algorithms, artificial intelligence, and the strange possibility of non-human minds. Where once scholars saw alchemy, today we see computation. Where once monks saw demons, today we see alien languages or artificial patterning. The manuscript has not changed, but the mirror it holds up reflects us differently, showing the contours of our own fears, of technology surpassing us, of meaning slipping away in the flood of data, of encountering minds that do not think like ours. This is perhaps its greatest secret. The Voynich manuscript is not only an artifact, but a stage upon which human imagination performs. Each era projects itself into the book, weaving its own story around the silent ink. And the book accepts it all, absorbs it, reflects it, waits. Its greatest strength may not be in what it tells us, but in how it forces us to reveal ourselves. Consider, for instance, the modern amateur cryptographers who devote years, even decades, to the manuscript. Some sit in quiet rooms, sketching out substitution ciphers on yellowed notepads. Others build computer programs to scan and analyze every letter. Some believe they are on the cusp of a grand revelation, that they are about to break through the silence into a flood of meaning. Others despair, convinced the book is deliberately meaningless, a cruel joke written centuries ago. What unites them is not the solution, but the obsession. In the mirror of the manuscript, they see their own hunger for order, their own refusal to accept chaos, and as the book resists, it forces them to confront the limits of their own minds. Even scholars who denounce it as nonsense cannot escape its mirror. Their dismissal reveals a different kind of fear, the fear of wasted energy, of being deceived, of pouring intellect into an abyss. To them, the manuscript reflects humanity's vulnerability to obsession itself. They see in it not wisdom but warning, that we are creatures who cannot help but seek meaning even when there is none. And so the book is always two things: the parchment object lying still in its bindings, and the living myth it becomes in the eyes of each age. It is both the ink on the page and the stories we tell about it. And perhaps, when we look at it in this way, we see that the Voynich manuscript is not only a historical mystery, but a kind of psychological experiment conducted across centuries. Whoever created it, whether monk, magician, hoaxer, or something far stranger, may have crafted not simply a text but a trap for the human imagination. For what else could explain its perfect endurance? Its words remain unread, its images uncategorized, yet it never fades into obscurity. Other books from its time crumble into dust. Other codes are broken, other mysteries resolve with the passage of time. But this one does not. It has woven itself into the cultural bloodstream, surviving because we cannot stop ourselves from looking. Perhaps it is not a message written to be understood. Perhaps it is a mirror written to be stared into, a text that waits not for a reader, but for endless readers, each bringing their own reflection. And there is a darker possibility still. If the book is a mirror, then maybe its truest purpose is not to be solved, but to study us. Each generation that approaches it reveals something about itself. Each failed attempt is a record not only of the manuscript's endurance, but of our own shifting fears and fascinations. In this sense, the book may already be succeeding at something we have not considered, documenting humanity not through words, but through our endless struggle with its silence. Stand before its pages long enough, and you may feel this yourself, the sense that it is not you who is studying the manuscript, but the manuscript that is studying you. The glyphs curl into patterns that seem to watch back. The plants twist like riddles waiting to see what you will make of them. The women in their pools gaze upward, not at each other but at you, the reader, across centuries. And in that gaze is the unsettling suspicion that the book has always been alive in some way, not because it carries a message, but because it carries our attention, our obsession, our willingness to stare into its mirror and not look away. Thus the manuscript survives, not as solved text but as a phenomenon, a mirror polished in the 15th century and handed down through time. We cannot know if the author intended this, or if it is merely the strange afterlife of an unfinished, unreadable book. But the effect is the same. It lives in us, in our theories, in our doubts, in our refusal to let go. Its mirror waits for each ophis to stand before it and see what reflection appears. And so, section 14 returns us to the heart of the manuscript, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a surface in which humanity has seen itself refracted for 900 years. To ask what it means is also to ask what we mean. To ask why it was written is also to ask why we are drawn to mysteries at all. Perhaps the truest secret of the Voynich manuscript is not hidden in its ink, but in the fact that it thus made us reveal ourselves age after age in its silent mirror. From here we step into the final chapter, where we consider how the manuscript has entered culture itself, not just as a relic, not just as a mystery, but as a living myth in the modern world. The longer a mystery endures, the more it ceases to be a mere puzzle and begins to transform into something larger. With the Voynich manuscript, the transformation is complete. What began as an odd and unreadable book in a Jesuit library has become, in our time, a modern myth, an object that exists not only in Yale's Beneke Library, but also in novels, films, music, video games, and endless corners of the internet. To encounter it now is no longer simply to study a text, but to step into a cultural current, a river of stories flowing out from its pages into countless other mediums. The Voynich manuscript has entered that rarefied realm where history and imagination blur, where fact is irrelevant and resonance is everything. This is the strange fate of all great mysteries. They shed their origins and become archetypes. Atlantis was once a story told by Plato, but today it stands as a symbol of every lost civilization. The Holy Grail was once a medieval romance motif, but now it embodies the idea of a transcendent, unattainable quest. Likewise, the Voynich manuscript is no longer just a 15th century codex. It is the archetype of the unreadable, the unsolved, the book that refuses to yield. It is the textual equivalent of a black hole, drawing in endless speculation, swallowing meaning and radiating only mystery. One can trace this transformation through culture itself. In literature, the Voynich manuscript has inspired fictional grimoires and imaginary books. Authors who wanted to conjure the atmosphere of forbidden knowledge have turned to the Voynich as a model. Umberto Eco referenced it in Foucault's Pendulum, where every act of interpretation becomes a trap. Narrowing to graphic novels, it appears as a cursed relic, its glyphs summoning not knowledge but madness. In detective thrillers, it becomes the key to conspiracies stretching back centuries. Each retelling strips it from its historical context and places it into a mythic one, a book that belongs not to scholars but to seekers, a symbol of knowledge, always just out of reach. In film and television, its myth has deepened. It slips into documentaries as the great unsolved code, always presented in hushed tones, accompanied by ominous music. But it also lurks in more imaginative spaces, inspiring set designers and storytellers who need a prop that instantly signals the unknowable. The Voynich has become visual shorthand for mystery itself. A single glimpse of its looping glyphs is enough to communicate the uncanny. Unlike other historical texts, it has crossed into the realm of pop culture icons, instantly recognizable, endlessly interpretable, and never truly pinned down. The internet has amplified this mythic status beyond measure. In forums and message boards, theories multiply like spores, sprouting into whole subcultures of speculation. Some threads are scholarly, attempting statistical analysis or linguistic modeling. Others veer into the strange and surreal, claims that the book is an alien artifact, a demonic grimoire, or the last surviving message from a forgotten civilization. In the digital age, the manuscript has become a participatory myth. Anyone with an internet connection can add their theory, their obsession, their reflection in the mirror. It is no longer only scholars who shape its meaning, but thousands of anonymous voices, each weaving their own thread into the tapestry of its legend. And myths, once born, do not need resolution to survive. In fact, they thrive on the absence of closure. The Voynich manuscript is powerful precisely because it resists. Every failed attempt to decode it feeds the legend. Every contradictory theory strengthens the aura of the unsolvable. A solved manuscript would be an object of history. An unsolved one is an object of myth. And so, perversely, the manuscript gains more life with every passing year of silence. Its refusal to speak makes it louder than words. This positions the Voynich in a long lineage of what might be called sacred unreadables. The oracle at Delphi, whose cryptic pronouncements were always ambiguous, shaped empires by the very fact of their obscurity. The Sibylline books of Rome were guarded and consulted but never fully known, existing more as potential than as accessible text. The Voynich fits into this lineage perfectly, a text whose true power lies not in what it says, but in the fact that we cannot know what it says. Its mystery is its message. In this way, the manuscript has transcended time. It no longer belongs to the 15th century, or to the Jesuit library where it lay hidden, or even to Wilfrid Voynich, who gave it his name. It belongs to all eras at once, a fixed point of mystery around which our shifting cultures orbit. To the Renaissance alchemist, it was a book of nature's secrets. To the wartime cryptographer, it was a cipher to crack. To the internet theorist, it is proof of aliens or AI. To the artist, it is a fountain of imagery. It is all of these and none of these because it has become an eternal mirror reflecting whatever myth the moment requires. Yet myths are not harmless. They exert gravity. They shape how we think, what we fear, and what we seek. For some, the Voynich manuscript is a benign curiosity, a delightful puzzle without an answer. For others, it becomes an obsession, consuming years of life. And in this way, the manuscript reveals the double-edged nature of myth itself. It inspires, but it also traps. It lures us with the promise of revelation, even when that revelation never arrives. It dangles the hope of meaning, but only so that we may circle endlessly around its silence. And perhaps this is why it has endured so powerfully. Facts fade, knowledge dates, but myths persist, Myths are stronger than truth because they do not depend on truth. They depend only on resonance, on the hunger of the human imagination. The Voynich. Manuscript, whether it ever contained a message or not, has become immortal because it now exists in the realm of story, where no radiocarbon test, no linguistic model, no decryption algorithm can touch it. It is no longer a manuscript to be solved. It is a myth to be told, retold, and carried forward. Stand before its pages today, whether in Yale's secure archive or in a high-resolution scan online, and you are not merely looking at an old book. You are standing at the intersection of centuries of human longing. You are standing in the current of a myth still being written, and if you listen closely, you may hear not the voice of its unknown author, but the murmur of all the voices it has gathered across time, the Jesuits, the collectors, the spies, the scholars, the artists, the conspiracists, the dreamers. It is not a single voice but a chorus. It is not a single meaning but an endless invitation to imagine. Thus, as section 15 closes, we see the Voynich manuscript not only as a text or an artifact, but as a living myth woven into the cultural imagination of humanity. It does not need to be solved to endure. It needs only to remain as it has for centuries, waiting, reflecting, unsettling. From here we step into the conclusion where we must finally reckon with what the manuscript means, not as code, not as history, but a symbol, the eternal reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only to be lived with. As our journey draws to a close, we return once more to the manuscript itself, the silent, watchful book that has traveled across centuries, defied translation, and resisted the brightest minds who sought to conquer it. To hold it, even in thought, is to feel the unsettling presence of something that does not yield to human categories. It is not scripture, not science, not poetry as we know it. It is a text that exists outside of the frameworks we trust to make sense of the world, and in that resistance lies its power. For more than 900 years, human hands have protected it, puzzled over it, and passed it on. Monks kept it hidden, Jesuits guarded it. Collectors coveted it, cryptographers broke themselves against it. Scientists radiocarbon dated it, and still, through all these chapters, the book has remained unbroken, whole, and intact, as though it carries within it a will to endure. Other books of its age have burned, dissolved into dust, or vanished into the gaps of history. But this one has survived, like a lone survivor from a world that may not be ours. What does it mean when an object outlasts explanation? Some say it is merely coincidence, a medieval curiosity, fascinating only because we do not yet know the trick of its construction. But others argue that its endurance reveals intention, that whoever made it knew it would resist us, knew it would confound and crafted it to travel time like a sealed capsule. If that is so, then it is not we who study the book. It is the book that studies us. Each new century it meets with silence, watching how we scramble, invent, and fail. It has become a mirror, showing us our hunger for meaning, our terror of the void, our unwillingness to let go of the unknown. And still the whispers persist. What if the writer was not one of us? When we look at the strange plants, the impossible stars, the women in their green pools, we sense patterns that seem both familiar and alien. Could the hand that made them have belonged to a mind shaped differently, Thanurs? Perhaps a traveler, from another culture, long lost to history, or something even stranger, something that looked at the world from an angle we cannot imagine. If language is the map of thought, then perhaps this manuscript is the map of a thought not human, a consciousness, brushing against ours for the briefest of moments, leaving behind a trail of ink that we mistake for words. Skeptics will say, no, this is wishful thinking. They will remind us of hoaxes, forgotten scripts, and the failures of imagination in past centuries. They will urge us to resist the pull of the extraordinary, and they are right, in part. We must not leap too quickly to wonder. But skeptics too must admit the book remains. It has not collapsed under analysis. It has not yielded to computers, nor to military cryptography, nor to the cold scalpel of science. Every rational explanation offered so far falters, leaving us in the same place where we began, in the presence of mystery. And perhaps that is where we are meant to remain. For the power of the manuscript is not in what it tells us nothing, but in what it awakens within us. It asks us to imagine worlds outside our own, languages unspoken, thoughts unthought. It invites us to live with uncertainty, to admit that not all questions have answers, and not all puzzles are meant to be solved. In a world increasingly defined by instant information, by answers at our fingertips, this book stands apart. It reminds us of the ancient truth that mystery is not the enemy of knowledge, but its companion. So we end where we began. In the candle-lit silence of a room, a page before us, glyphs curling like vines across the parchment. The ink is steady, deliberate. Someone, or something, made these marks with care. They had purpose, though we do not know it. They believed in what they were doing, though we cannot share their belief, and they left behind a legacy that has outlived them by centuries. When you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you will dream of it. A garden of impossible plants, swaying under alien stars, women bathing in green waters, words that shimmer but refuse to stay still long enough to be read. You may wake unsettled or strangely calm, or with a feeling that you yourself were inside the book, wandering its pages like corridors. And if you do, remember this: you are not alone. Generations before you have dreamed the same dream. Generations after you will dream it again. The manuscript does not need to be solved to matter. It matters because it survives, because it resists, because it reminds us of the vastness of what we do not yet know. Whether it was written by a clever medieval scribe, a forgotten culture, or a mind not quite human, its message is the same. The universe is wider, stranger, and more wondrous than we dare to believe. And so we close the cover, slowly, as though tucking a restless child into bed. The candle flickers low, the room grows quiet. The book remains, silent but not asleep, waiting for the next pair of hands to open it, the next mind to wrestle with its silence, the next century to ask its questions. All over again. In the end, the mystery does not belong to the manuscript, it belongs to us.